During a so-called Corrections Day, lawmakers could repeal rules and regulations that they think are unnecessary. You'll hear from House Speaker Newt Gingrich, state and local government officials, business representatives, authorities on congressional procedures, and members of the two House Rules and Government Reform subcommittees holding this joint hearing. This program runs about 3.5 hours.
This joint subcommittee hearing of the Government Reform and House Rules and the House Rules Committee will come to order. I'm pleased to have Speaker Gingrich for us. I would commend him on his leadership in advancing Corrections Day. I believe Corrections Day will be a powerful new tool to eliminate rules and regulations that are expensive, destroy jobs, and in many cases are just plain stupid. It's a pleasure to have the Speaker here with us today. I'm also particularly honored to be able to chair this with my colleagues who have a vast amount of greater experience than I do in running this institution, and it's an honor and a privilege for me to be here today. Now it's my pleasure also...
I should say that none of us have chaired any more hearings than you have, though,
We definitely are going to keep busy. And it's also my pleasure to introduce the ranking member of my subcommittee, Mr. Peterson of Minnesota, and Mr. Dreyer, who is the chairman of the subcommittee of the Rules Committee. Mr. Dreyer, do you want to represent or introduce your ranking member?
Well, let me just say that it's a great privilege for me to be here in behalf of the Rules Subcommittee, Rules and Organization of the House. We're very pleased to have the full chairman of the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Solomon, and the vice chairman of our subcommittee, Mr. Diaz-Balart. Are there any other Rules Committee members here? Oh, Mr. Bielenson is here from the Rules Committee, and Mrs. Price is here from the Rules Committee. And this clearly demonstrates that we, as a committee, are making history, and that we, for the first time, have really taken our show on the road, so to speak, teaming up with this subcommittee. And it's great to have Mr. McIntosh as my partner here. On the 4th of January, the new Republican majority implemented a package of rules changes that, among other things, reformed the committee system for the 104th Congress. But there's one reform that clearly did not need to be spelled out in House rules. That is the desire among the new committee and subcommittee chairmen to work together rather than against each other. And I believe that this hearing is symbolic of our commitment to make Congress more responsive to the American people. And Speaker Gingrich observed that in seniority, we moved from McIntosh, Dreyer, Clinger, and Solomon in descending order here, which was obviously a very interesting observation of the way things have changed here in the Congress. I want to commend Speaker Gingrich for what he has done in bringing forward Corrections Day, working with Mayor of San Diego, Susan Golding, Governor John Engler, and others. And I believe that we have a great opportunity here to proceed with dealing with some of the most stupid and inane laws that have come down the pike, and I hope we'll be able to put into operation a system that will address that. Thank you very much, and we look forward to your testimony, Mr. Speaker.
We will dispense with opening statements, except I wanted to recognize my chairman, Mr. Clinger, and I understand Mr. Solomon has a statement he'll put in or make after the speaker.
I would also sit my statement after the speaker has spoken, but just want to welcome our speaker and also join in commending him for what I think is an inspired idea, and now we just have to figure out how to do it and make it effective. And look forward to hearing him and the rest of our witnesses.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I'm over here. I'd like the opportunity to make a very brief opening statement, no longer than 2 minutes in length.
If the gentleman would yield, or would you prefer to do it before or after the speaker?
I'd prefer to do it at the beginning of the hearing.
All right, Mr. Waxman.
Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, and Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to see you and welcome you to our subcommittee's hearing. I think it's a wise idea for us to want to correct problems that need to be corrected, whether it's from bad regulations or bad legislation, and we ought to do that on a regular basis during legislative reauthorizations or through some process on the House floor. We now have the suspension calendar, which can serve for that purpose. But I do want to point out two pitfalls. One, I think we ought to be sure that we follow an open, bipartisan process that ensures that special interests are not being provided special access to correction legislation. And secondly, we should provide ample opportunities for careful consideration of the substance of the corrections legislation so that we can be sure we're not legislating by anecdote. I just want to say that we've noticed both problems so far this year. In the first 100 days, special interests had unprecedented access to the legislative process, and I refer to articles that indicated that corporate polluters and other special interests were given a room in the Capitol to write talking points and draft amendments for proponents of H.R. 450 and H.R. 9. And likewise, we've heard a lot of anecdotal evidence that turned out to be incorrect. We ought not to be rushing forward with legislation in the process of something called Corrections Day or any other process without it being based on a sound backing, clear rationale, and bipartisan support. Otherwise, I certainly support the idea of trying to correct problems. That's our job through oversight and through legislative changes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Waxman. Mr. Bielenson also wanted to make a few comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I shall be brief. Basically, I want to reinforce a couple of points that my friend Mr. Waxman has just made. I appreciate, along with the others, having this opportunity to join with our friends on the Government Reform and Oversight Committee to learn more about what having a Corrections Day in the House of Representatives might entail. We're looking forward to hearing what the Speaker is proposing along these lines and what our other witnesses have to say about the idea. At the outset, Mr. Chairman, I must admit that I'm skeptical of the need to define a new class of legislation and to establish a new process for considering bills that meet that definition. The key question that I hope the proponents of a Corrections Day will answer is, what makes corrections bills different from other legislation? It seems to me that virtually any bill which changes an existing law could be considered a correction to that law. How does one narrow the scope? Why is it necessary to do so? There's some suspicion among some members that the process for Corrections Day will entail shortcutting the legislative process in some way, that it will enable parties which have a grievance with the government to obtain something they seek without a full hearing, a full airing of the issue. We very much hope that's not the case. If the goal of Corrections Day is to achieve fast action on changing a law or regulation that presumably everyone thinks is excessive, burdensome, or ridiculous, it can be done simply by having the appropriate committee report a bill and then bringing it to the floor under an existing procedure, whether that be unanimous consent, suspension of the rules, or regular order. This leadership, as we all know, and I say this with sincere admiration, has demonstrated a remarkable talent for getting committees to report bills at record speed. For whatever purpose the Speaker hopes to serve by establishing a Corrections Day, it's our hope that the regular legislative process will be used. The process that entails committee hearings, questioning, consultation with experts, and adequate deliberation in an open and bipartisan manner. Again, we appreciate the opportunity to hear from the Speaker and other witnesses on this matter, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to make these brief remarks.
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Bielenson. Mr. Peterson.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I wasn't going to make any comments, but, you know, I think this is a good idea, and I disagree here a little bit. I think that we've actually, in a way, abdicated our responsibility by not by giving more power actually to the bureaucrats than we give to ourselves, and somehow or another we've got to take this back. And I guess I'm hoping that we can figure out some way here to do that. It's frankly, you know, puzzling to me why we would have a situation where we can't get rid of regulations that bureaucrats have promulgated as a Congress, and somehow or another we have to get back to a process where we can do that.
Now I think we should hear from the Speaker, who has proposed this new process, and I think it's every time I described it to anybody in Indiana, they were extremely excited about it. So without further ado, let me present the Speaker of the House, Mr. Gingrich.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate very much the chance to be here, and I actually think it was helpful to have the prior comments, because I think it legitimately frames what the real concerns are and how we should approach this. I start from the premise that we have been trapped into a system in which we either have very large policy changes, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, to take two examples that Mr. Waxman is very familiar with, or we do nothing. And so you end up with Senator Proxmire, who is a very senior member of the other body, issuing a Golden Fleece Award, which was great public relations, except if these things were that dumb, why wasn't a senior senator able to do more than issue a press release? And so you end up in a situation where the difference is not policy, the difference is implementation. And in effect, we say, well, we'll do sort of generic oversight. And if we find in a general pattern that we have been dumb enough, consistently enough, in enough places, we will eventually pass a rule to change being quite that dumb. And I was like everybody else. You go back home and you say, well, people would complain about something that was just self-evidently stupid. And you say, boy, I sure agree with you, but those are the bureaucrats. We're only the elected officials. And I finally began to figure out that this was exactly backwards, that the way the Founding Fathers had designed the system, they had not set out to replace King George's tyranny with a bureaucratic tyranny of Americans. But they actually thought that elected officials were supposed to be powerful. And that part of the frustration in the country, and part of the term limit movement, and part of the turmoil that leads to Ross Perot as a third-party candidate, is this general sense that you keep hiring people and you keep sending them up there, and they don't get the system under control. So what would it be like to get the system under control? Now, Corrections Day, frankly, was an accident. Mayor Susan Golding of San Diego came to see us, along with Mayor Dick Reardon of Los Angeles. She got to talking about an Environmental Protection Agency requirement that San Diego build a secondary waste treatment plant, a requirement which EPA had lost in district court to the city of San Diego. And she said, here is a $10 billion requirement, which makes perfect sense on the Great Lakes, except, as most of you know from geography, San Diego's not on the Great Lakes, it's on the Pacific Ocean. And they had Scripps Oceanographic Institute testifying that if you took enhanced primary waste at 350 feet below sea level on the outer continental shelf of the largest body of water in the world, that was fine. But instead, EPA, sitting in Washington, was saying, no, it's not fine. We don't care what oceanographers think. We want you to spend $10 billion of your local money. And I said, you know, I sat back for a minute because this is what I'd heard all my life. Except this time we were supposed to be in charge and we had claimed we'd be different. And I said, well, why don't we correct it? I mean, the difference, I would say to Mr. Waxman, is the difference between policy and implementation. You may have a policy which is in general correct, but in implementing it, an agency may be doing something so profoundly dumb. And I'm not going to, I don't particularly debate the San Diego example. I'll give you a second one from the IRS in a second. But an implementation which is not illegal, it's just stupid. I mean, to be told what we're going to do is be stupidly legal, but pay your taxes and be proud of us, I think is an inadequate model. And I began to think about state legislatures where it's not at all uncommon to pass a fairly narrowly drawn bill designed to cure one specific problem, because at the state legislative level you can afford to do that. So let me give you the second example, which I think is an absolute prime candidate for a Corrections Day procedure. And let me say, I agree entirely that it should be reviewed in the open. It should be done on a bipartisan basis. There should be staff involvement in both parties. Everything should be out in the open, and we shouldn't take anecdotes, because all of us can come up, you know, with our particular version. But let me give you the second anecdote, if you will, that's been in the public press. The Internal Revenue Service is now talking about doing a lifestyle audit, where they decide that they think you have been chosen, and they're going to come and review everything about your life to see whether or not they approve of the amount of taxes you've been paying. I have yet to find anybody who thinks it is rational in a free society to hire a bureaucracy to do a lifestyle audit. And yet, I'm certain that within the current broad explanation of IRS powers, they are technically within their rights. I would just suggest to you that the country would be very happy to have the Congress intervene quite decisively and say to the IRS, we think that's a step too far. We don't think you ought to go and harass innocent taxpayers because you've decided you want to challenge their lifestyle. Now, I'm just raising that as an example of what could be a very useful, very narrowly drawn bill. Obviously, go back to the earlier point, that should come out of Ways and Means. It ought to be reported to Rules. This is my guess, although I frankly hope that the two committees meeting together will themselves make the recommendation for the procedure, that there should be some orderly procedure. But there's a step beyond this. I believe if citizens, whether they're private citizens, they're corporations, there are trade associations, or we tend to forget special interest groups can be a Weyerhaeuser or it can be the Sierra Club. They're both special interests. So whatever special interest might be in a negotiation, or it could be the city government or the state government, if their first step in negotiating with the bureaucrat is not to be powerless, but to say, you are doing something so dumb, I'm going to take it to my congressman or congresswoman and ask them to consider it for Corrections Day, I think you automatically rebalance a little bit of the power between bureaucrats and citizens. Secondly, if through a review process we have a pattern once a week or once a month of bringing up the dumbest things and repealing them, we begin to set a standard of common sense that I think does have an impact. Third, if a particular agency shows up month after month or week after week, I think that sends a signal to the particular oversight committee, you ought to review this agency from top to bottom. And then lastly, let me be very direct. I think if we were to run into an agency which, despite our best efforts over a 2 or 3 year period, didn't get it, that the correct answer is to zero it out and start over and hire an entire new agency. I mean, I think that the elected officials of this country, if we're going to reestablish belief in a free society, have an obligation to be responsive to the taxpayers, and that the bureaucracy is subordinate. No single action subordinate. Let me make this very clear. No single elected official should be able to reach into a bureaucracy to, in fact, change something. That would be replacing the rule of law with the rule of individuals, and that would be dictatorship. But we as a collective legislative body, with the signature of the President, should be superior to the specific concern, any specific agency, which we create, we pay for, and we empower. Now, to give you an example of how far this idea has gone, it started as the idea of let's correct the San Diego situation. I explained it to a breakfast of Republican governors, and Governor John Engler suggested that we make it a regular experience. Just talking about it casually, Governor Tommy Thompson of Wisconsin, Governor George Allen of Virginia, Governor Terry Branstad of Iowa, the Community College Association, the Association of Private Pension and Welfare Plans, the City of Fort Worth, Governor Howard Dean of Vermont, Governor Jim Edgar, have all come up with very specific proposals. And in Governor Edgar's case, he went back home, told his senior staff about the idea, and brought in a 5-page, single-space letter with correction proposals from the state of Illinois. Now, I'm just suggesting that we don't want to get into micromanagement, and we ought to set some standard of relative cost, relative dumbness, relative urgency, but there ought to be a screening process, and I want to commend in particular Congresswoman Barbara Vukanovich and Congressman Bill Zeliff and Congressman McIntosh, who have been working on this for the House Republican leadership, and they're going to talk about it a little bit. Tom DeLay has been developing this whole question of how do you deregulate. He wrote the foreword to a new book called Red Tape in America, Stories from the Front Line by Craig Richardson and Jeff Ziebert. And I'll just give you 2 last examples so you can understand where we're coming from. Again, drawing the distinction between general policy and legal but dumb behavior. 2 examples out of Red Tape in America. An elderly woman in Wyoming was prohibited by bureaucrats from planting a bed of roses on her land. In Florida, the owner of a 3-person silk screening company was fined by OSHA for not having a hazardous communications program for his 2 part-time employees. Now, there's some point here where common sense, how do you, in a free society, in the information age with great complexity, how do you reinstill common sense in bureaucracies which all too often are made up of people who've never done any of the work they're supervising and who've never been to the site they're setting a regulation for? And so I think Corrections Day, properly approached, can in fact be one more tool in that direction. I think it has to be done in an orderly, open, bipartisan manner. It has to be done with expert consultation. But I think if the average citizen knew that we were serious about correcting the bureaucracy when it was dumb, and if they knew that they could go to their member of the Congress, Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative, and say to them, this one is so dumb, I think you ought to propose it for Corrections Day, I think you would, in fact, see more common sense in the system. I appreciate very, very much the 2 committees on a common sense, practical basis getting together to meet like this. I think it's exactly the way we ought to function, and I commend all of you for participating.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I truly appreciate your effort in this regard and can tell you that literally everyone I talked to in Indiana was very enthusiastic about it. I know you've got a very tight schedule. I wanted to see if you had any time and any desire to take a couple questions.
Particularly, I want to allow any of our friends on the Democratic side who have any concerns about the way we'd approach this, because this will not work if it's just a partisan game. but it will work if every member of the House feels that they have standing and they have an opportunity to bring things to the floor and to be part of a genuine effort to educate and apply common sense to the bureaucracy.
Terrific. And we'll ask you a few questions. When you need to leave, let us know. Mrs. Collins had wanted to make a statement, I believe, and I thought I might start with her if she has any questions, but then open it up for anybody else. Mrs. Collins, did you have any questions for the speaker?
It's a strange time to make minutes since you're an opening statement.
Well, let me say this. I have an opening statement that I'm going to give at the end of the speaker's remarks. I think that'll be better because there's a flow that's going on here that I don't want to interrupt.
Thank you, Mrs. Collins. Mr. Peterson.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, I think we're in agreement on where we're heading, you and I, with this, and I think others. My concern is how we're going to get there. A little bit of research that I've done on this tells me that you're exactly right. We're in a situation where either we've got to get rid of the whole statute or we don't get anything accomplished. My question is, how do we get off of that without changing? Do we have to change the Administrative Procedures Act? Do we have to, I guess I'm having a hard time understanding
Well,
exactly. If you're
Peterson,
going to be that fair and that bipartisan, I'm just afraid that we're going to get to the point where we're going to get into a situation where it's all or nothing, which is where we've been for the last 20, 30 years. I think you're being too fair maybe to make this work. So,
well, we don't have to be unanimous. I mean, I would, for example, argue that bills will break into two groups. And again, I'm not a lawyer, so some of this, I think, has to be worked by staff experts to make sure that it's technically done right. Let me say, let's take the example of the IRS proposal to have lifestyle audits. There should be a way, frankly, to write a directive to the IRS that says, you're not authorized to do this, period. And now it's got to be written technically correctly. If it turned out, as Ways and Means, I would assume, would want to have a hearing on it, and sometimes you might want to have a hearing on 7 corrections in the same day, or another correction may be so big and so complicated you want to have only a hearing on that topic. Let's take this example. If it turned out, when we checked with members on both sides of the aisle, that this was a relatively popular idea, and I think, frankly, blocking the IRS from having this kind of audit will turn out to be overwhelmingly popular, I would recommend that you design a procedure where, for those items, it comes up under suspension on a bipartisan basis. We send it to the Senate, and frankly, I mean, I think Senator Daschle and Senator Dole have a much harder problem than we do because of the unprotected nature of Senate legislation. But maybe we could even get an agreement over there that there are things so commonsensical they could actually just pass, as opposed to becoming subject to filibuster or amendment in the usual game plan. So I would want to start with the idea that any time we had a bill where we had a bipartisan broad agreement, we do exactly as I think Mr. Waxman was saying, we bring it up under suspension. Part of the difference is I want to communicate to the country the idea that there is a corrections process, that your member is part of it, and that if you run into a bureaucracy that's particularly dumb or particularly outrageous, that you have an avenue of power, not just an avenue of griping, and that if it turns out you're right and it's legitimate and serious, that something can be done. Now, I think even if we were only to pass 4 or 5 corrections a month, and I think we could do more than that on the suspension basis, but even 4 or 5 a month would send a signal of change to the country that would rebuild, I think, significantly faith in elected officials. So I guess that's, I don't know if that's responsive, but that's sort of how I see it happening.
well, as I understand it, the situation now is that you can, with some of these programs, you have to get at it through the appropriations process. I guess that's the only way we can.
I think, no, I think that's a matter of scheduling. And
well,
when I leave, which I'm told Senator Dole wants me to come, and I tend to be very responsive to Senator Dole in these kind of moments. So let me just say, I'd want to hear from the Rules Chairman, but I believe that many things which in the past we tried to get at in the appropriations process was a function of what could be scheduled. And that, in fact, if the Rules Committee were willing to work with the membership on this specific corrections process, we wouldn't have to encumber appropriations bills with all sorts of extraneous things. We could go straight at changing them. And that would be my goal. Let me just back up one thing and say one last thing, because I'm told I've got to run over this meeting. I'd really like this. If this is going to work, it has to be bipartisan. It has to be genuine. It can't just be game playing. And Mr. Waxman's injunction is right. It can't be taking care of a handful of lobbyists or taking care of somebody's special interest. There's got to be a sense that there's a standard you rise above, that the bureaucracy has to be particularly dumb to do it, and that it has to be something where it's silly to go home and defend it. That's probably the best standard I can give you. If it's silly to go home and defend it, why don't we quit doing it? And I want to ask on a bipartisan basis both committees to design a procedure so every member could go home by June and say to their constituents, if something happens that's so silly that you can't really defend it, let me know, because I'd like to bring it to the attention of the Corrections Day process. I think that's the spirit I'd like to set.
I'll yield.
Sure.
Mr. Speaker, I don't disagree with what you're saying, because we ought to be able to respond to problems. We ought to be able to respond to them in a simple, finite way and not have to do a major bill to deal with a specific problem. But let me just ask you this question about the IRS matter. I do want to put in the record a letter from our colleague, Congressman Norman Mineta, who has indicated, I think very convincingly, that the San Diego example is not a good example. But that'll be debated. But the IRS issue raises a question in my mind. Let's say you may have a man who owns a restaurant. He pays no taxes because he claims he has no income. He buys a $90,000 Jaguar, buys a $500,000 home, and then buys another $500,000 vacation home. Shouldn't the IRS be able to do something to follow this man? Because it seems like something may be wrong.
In that case, Mr. Waxman, there's a discrepancy sufficiently large to have a presumption that there may be criminal conduct. We have been told in the news reports, and this may turn out, if Ways and Means hold a hearing, not to be true, but we've been told in news reports that the IRS is thinking about randomly pulling names on a random basis and then doing a lifestyle audit and forcing you to prove how you can have your property. Now, I think, I was responding to reports I'd been told from several news sources that they're going to be randomly pulling people out and randomly auditing them. Now, I think the average American's idea of the IRS showing up on a random lottery basis.
Well, I would agree with you. That would be horrifying, and we ought to stop
So
that.
we ought to just look and see which it is.
In other words, you would want the Committee of Jurisdiction to take testimony on the issue so we're sure we're not
Absolutely.
legislating without the full facts and not just on somebody's anecdote. And secondly, you would want it on a bipartisan basis, so it would require a two-thirds vote, because it's just obvious to us.
I said there are two procedures. I would certainly want it to. I would want it to go through on a purely bipartisan basis, and I'd like the staff on both sides, the members on both sides to participate. If it was something which couldn't get two-thirds, but could get 60, could clearly get a majority on a bipartisan basis, I would feel very reluctant to bring up as a correction something which was only Republican. It would seem to me that there's something profoundly wrong. It can't be that dumb if you can't get Democrat votes.
Well, it's got to be profoundly stupid, and if it's something profoundly stupid and can't get something that's more than a simple majority, it sounds to me there's a contradiction here. If it is controversial, then it is controversial.
Do you really want to require it to have two-thirds? Do you really want to require it to have two-thirds? I just raised that as something for you all to look at, and I'd like to get back from you a recommendation on how to proceed and how do we set the right threshold. But I do believe we will do the country a lot of good if we can send the signal that we are very serious about giving people some vehicle for something which is so outrageous that currently they feel powerless about.
But the Committee of Jurisdiction would hold.
Absolutely. In my judgment, you have to start with the experts who spent the time studying the topic. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for launching this project. Before we get to our second panel, let me now turn to those who deferred on their opening statements. Mr. Solomon, do you have a statement?
Mr. Chairman, yes, I do, and I hate to take up all of the time, but I do have some points I would like to make that might clarify the air for some of the members. First, I really want to commend the Speaker on his innovative and his constructive proposal for a House Corrections Day. I can't think of anything that is more important that will face this Congress during this session. I think this is a much-needed antidote to public cynicism over the federal government and its sometimes unresponsive and bundling bureaucracies, and my district has suffered immeasurably because of it. Second, I really want to commend Subcommittee Chairman David Dreyer and David McIntosh, as well as the full committee chairman, Mr. Klinger, for really taking the initiative to hold this joint subcommittee hearing of our two committees. Also, Barbara Vukanovich and Bill Zelliff, who are out in the audience, and Tom DeLay, who will be testifying in panels later on. I hope this will set an example for other committees and subcommittees to work closer together on problems of mutual concern. It is certainly preferable to expending time and energy on needless turf fights, which we in the Rules Committee run into all the time. Third, without preempting or prejudging the various proposals that will be made by various witnesses today for creating Corrections Day, let me put forward a few standards and suggestions for consideration in formulating a workable Corrections Day process. And this is purely my opinion that has arrived from my experiences with dealing with all of the complex rules and the turf battles with all of the committees over all of these years. First, there should be a major concern to a large segment of our membership, as Mr. Gingrich, our speaker, has said. They should be confined to a single subject. I do not think we should in-block groups for debate. They should not involve the expenditure of additional monies or the raising of additional revenues. Again, we'd be getting away from the original intent of the Corrections Day. They should be reported by the Committee of Jurisdiction so that members will have the benefit of a full report to allow them to make fully informed decisions, and that deals with what Mr. Waxman was worried about before. They should be referred to a new corrections calendar, in my opinion, in addition to their normal calendar, only by direction of the Speaker. They should be considered on a Corrections Day either once or twice a month, preferably on Tuesdays after suspensions. That would be the logical time to take them up. They should be subject to not less than 1 hour of debate. They should not be subject to amendment unless offered by the manager of the bill, which is the case, as you know, under current suspension bills. They should also require, in my opinion, a 3/5 supermajority vote for passage rather than the 2/3 vote required for suspensions, because we can always go to the split suspension in 2/3 if we want to. They should not be subject to a motion to recommit and should remain eligible for consideration by special rule if they do not achieve the 3/5 vote for passage. That's what happens with suspensions now. If they happen to be defeated, they can always go to the Rules Committee under normal rules and procedures of the House. Mr. Chairman, I think we should avoid overloading the corrections calendar to the point where members do not have an idea of what they are voting on. And we should avoid unreported corrections bills. Again, something that some of the Democrat minority was concerned about, that would force us to base our votes only on anecdotal evidence or heat-of-the-moment impulses or passions, and we all have those from time to time. If we establish a process along these lines that I've outlined, I really do think we can have a truncated process without sacrificing informed and deliberative decision-making. I certainly remain open to other suggestions and ideas that will make our witnesses and others by putting together a Corrections Day process. But hopefully we will be united and guided by the overriding goal as laid out by the Speaker of this House of developing a process that is truly workable and that is deliberative and effective in addressing the problems of unnecessary, burdensome, duplicative, and obsolete agency regulations of actions. Now, I just have to take a minute to talk about the problem itself. Let me speak to the various problems I've encountered in my congressional district and even my own hometown of Glens Falls in upstate New York, a little community of 16,000 people. As you might expect, nestled in the middle of the Adirondack Mountains on the shores of Lake George, tourism and forestry and dairy are the major industries in my hometown. Both of these industries, the three of them, are threatened by extreme environmental regulations. Another industry in the region, a major industry, 3 major medical device companies are now moving offshore because of restrictive and senseless Food and Drug Administration regulations. And most recently, a 100-year-old cement company may be forced to close their doors because of a new interpretation of the clean air regulations by the EPA. It's been there for 134 years. Mr. Chairman, Glens Falls, New York is small town USA. It was voted that back in 1944, just a beautiful little town. And just look at what federal government regulations are doing to it today. It is so pathetic. Let me give you specific examples of the devastation that misguided government regulations have caused in that hometown. The cluster rule. was but one reason why Scott Paper Company laid off 400 people and shut down 2 paper mills. The cluster rule may force Finch Prine Paper Company to lay off 1,000 people in an area where the unemployment is as high as it is in the entire United States already and go out of business. The Safe Drinking Water Act requires hotel and motel owners to put up unsafe drinking water warning signs, killing tourism and costing hundreds of jobs just because they aren't on a municipal water supply and they meet all the other health regulations, all of them. New EPA kiln emission standards could put the Glens Falls Cement Company out of business, another 130 people unemployed who cannot find jobs ever if that goes out of business up in the mountains where I live. In 1994, Mallinckrodt Medical announced plans to relocate its manufacturing operations to Ireland and Mexico, where they can market their products directly to the EEC without waiting 5 to 10 years for the FDA approval. That costs us 450 jobs. They are gone. A similar medical device, AngioDynamics, is also considering closing its doors and moving to Ireland for the very same reason. And let me just outline a traumatic effect of the cluster rule on the paper industry. Mr. Chairman, the cluster rule is the biggest and most costly rule ever proposed by the EPA for a single industry in America. Because of the inflexibility of tremendous cost involved, 33 U.S. paper mills could be forced to close, eliminating 21,000 jobs. For Finch Prine, I mentioned before in my hometown, the effect is even more damaging. That is because the most stringent aspect of the EPA's cluster rule applies solely to the small category of paper-grade sulfite mills that they belong to. This is the aspect which requires totally chlorine-free bleaching. Now, EPA intended to eliminate the discharge of chlorinated compounds into waterways, and they determined that technology did not exist to permit the larger category of kraft mills to adopt totally chlorine-free paper bleaching. Thus, only paper-grade sulfite mills would have to comply. In other words, all the kraft mills can stay open, but the sulfite mills have to close down, close their doors. This regulation undermines the economy of upstate New York. It is not based on good science. It upsets competitive balance in the marketplace. And members, this is a prime example of the type of damage regulations would need to remedy through the Corrections Day. I just pray to God that we're going to be able to enact this, and we are going to be able to come back and revisit some of these absolutely absurd regulations that discriminate against certain segments and certain industries in America. So, Mr. Chairman, I thank both of you for holding this hearing today. We're going to do something with this, and it's going to change the economy of this country, and we're going to be competitive with other industrialized nations around this world. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you coming, and your input into this will be invaluable in moving forward and understanding how the rules should operate. Let me turn now to Mrs. Collins for your statement. Thank you for deferring earlier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The federal government has enormous responsibilities in administering the laws we pass in this Congress. We in the Congress have similar responsibilities in turn to oversee the operations and activities of the executive branch and federal agencies. Oversight is a principal responsibility of the Committee on Government Reform and Oversight, and one which I take very seriously. That's why I am concerned by proposals that bypass the normal protections of the legislative process. Hearings, debate, deliberation, and amendments cannot be dispensed with simply for public relations. I have similar concerns about Corrections Day. Once again, the Republican leadership seems to have a press release in search of a policy. I sincerely hope that the Speaker and other Republican members here today can reassure us that this is not, in fact, the case. There is much about the concept of Corrections Day that I can support. Reevaluating legislation and correcting errors is something that Congress should do more often. For example, I supported an excellent example of a correction on the House floor just a short time ago to repeal the tax rate enjoyed by billionaires who renounced their American citizenship. I think we can all agree that Congress and government should do a better job and that wasteful and foolish practices should be changed. Congress bears a responsibility for some of these problems, and federal departments in issuing regulations or administering laws can create or exacerbate others. However, Some of the speaker's public comments about Corrections Day have given me serious cause for concern. In a press release dated March 23rd of this year, he announced the appointment of a partisan task force, the Corrections Day Steering Group of Republicans, to review suggestions for bills to take up on Corrections Day. Now, this panel is not bound by any rules or laws to operate in public, and so we don't know where the ideas for corrections are coming from. Matter of fact, I have a list here of a corrections inventory. I don't know where this list came from. Among those are Department of Education 1992 Higher Education Act, post-secondary review entities, private pension law reform, IRS code revisions to provide design-based safe harbors, EPA, rainfall overflow, sanitary sewer systems, etc. But I can guess where the list came from. This is a paper prepared for Republican members, and it contains a wish list of special interest candidates for Corrections Day, some of which may go far beyond the idea of undoing obvious errors. It seems obvious to me that lobbyists for special interests will converge on the Republican task force en masse with so-called corrections, which have little or nothing to do with errors or problems in law or regulations, while the average American will be absolutely frozen out. How can we be assured that members of the public will be heard and that the panel will not be dominated by special interests? We don't need any more hastily drafted, sloppily written legislation, secretly prepared by special pleaders coming to the floor of the House. And so, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, I would strongly urge the Republican leadership not to create any new type of legislation which circumvents the safeguards and protections we have in the rules, protections designed to give us time to think and analyze and to do a good job ourselves. If we have made mistakes, we may do worse by trying to rush in to correct them. Corrections Day should be a bipartisan process. We should utilize the existing legislative procedures, not short-circuit them. These matters should be handled through our normal process in committees and under the open procedures endorsed in the original version of the contract with America. The Democratic members of the relevant committee should approve any legislation to be brought to the floor. Selection of bills should be out in the open. The bills should involve matters which are truly non-controversial and should not involve serious disagreements over legislative policy. If we can make changes to improve the performance and responsiveness of Congress, we should. We should only do so in ways which enhance the quality of the work we do rather than create new processes which serve the special interests rather than the interests of the American people. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mrs. Collins. I'd like to now recognize my chairman, Mr. Klinger, for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'm pleased to join with you and Chairman Dreyer, Chairman Solomon, and all of the members of the panel here today in this very, I think, interesting, innovative, and exciting prospect that we're going to be considering and discussing this morning. Depending on how it's structured, I think Corrections Day can provide us with a truly unique opportunity to fix in an expedited manner some of the laws, policies, or regulations that simply don't make much sense and are unnecessary, outdated, overreaching. We're going to have a chance to reinvent government, not just through talking about it, but by taking concrete steps to make government more reasonable and efficient. There is no reason at all to continue unnecessary or nonsensical government policies. We can change the way government operates and show that we will teach it new tricks. It's also an opportunity for us to communicate to Americans outside of the Beltway that not only are we serious about changing government, but to come forward and help us identify what may be needed in terms of a correction. I think that's one of the most innovative ideas, is we're really going to be encouraging Americans to come forward with those suggestions that they think clearly make no sense and have the sense that something can actually be done about it, that they're not just doing something that makes where there's no action can be taken. Perhaps most importantly in structuring Corrections Day is that we need to define what is a correction. It may be most useful initially to focus our attention on administrative policies and regulations. Coming from the Oversight Committee perspective, regulations and policies often do not receive thorough oversight review since they have not been funneled through the legislative process. In addition, policies and regulations promoted by federal agencies often go far beyond what statutes intended, if there even is a statutory basis, thus providing government bureaucrats with power that extends beyond what is held by Congress. For example, the Title V permitting regulations proposed by EPA to comply with the Clean Air Act go way beyond what the statute requires and could result in an extremely high cost to our economy without corollary environmental benefits, some of the examples that Chairman Solomon alluded to. If regular order is not the procedure that is used to structure Corrections Day, I do have specific suggestions that I would like to put on the table for consideration. As I understand it, the committee processes might be short-circuited. The disadvantage of bypassing committees is that issues would not be vented or considered thoroughly by various stakeholders in a public forum, and I think that's a very serious concern that needs to be dealt with. First, if this is the case, I believe that we would need to establish a standardized review process by which proposals made for Corrections Day will be closely scrutinized and issues would be vented. This may involve establishing an oversight review board consisting of congressional members, perhaps using some of the chairman of the Government Reform and Oversight and Rules Committee, who would then serve to consult with Oversight, Appropriations, and Authorizing Committee members on issues within their jurisdiction. The Committee of Jurisdiction should be involved in the review process so that their expertise can be applied to whatever the issue is under consideration. We do not want to find ourselves taking proposals to the floor that have serious unintended consequences, which can happen if we do not give them thorough venting in the committee. So what are the views of the stakeholders? What is the justification for the needed change? Does the proposed legislative fix address the problem? Each proposal should have to meet specific criteria prior to being considered for floor action. And third, Mr. Chairman, I believe that there should be some mechanism for prioritization of proposals. For example, whether we want to go after the most costly and ridiculous regulations and policies first, or whether we might want to consider having various themes for each so-called correction day, for example, a small business day. By having themes, this would allow for identification of many different policies or regulations that impact a specific constituency and provide a united effort and a unified effort to get those issues resolved in one context. Corrections Day, I think, is an exciting opportunity for us to call attention to Washington policies, regulations, or procedures that make no sense, and in some cases, as the Speaker said, are just plain dumb, and put an end to them. At the same time, I would urge that we move cautiously and establish careful review procedures. So I appreciate consideration of these suggestions, and I certainly look forward to hearing suggestions from our other witnesses who have given this a great deal of thought, particularly the task force, which we'll be hearing from. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Chairman Klinger. We do want to get to the next panel, but let me just check to see if any other members of the two subcommittees have a statement they'd like to make. We can also put them in the record if they've got any written statements. Let me now move to the next panel with the Whip of the Congress, Mr. DeLay, Mrs. Bokanovich, who is the chairman of the task force for the Speaker to develop this procedure, Mr. Zelliff, who has served on that task force, and Mr. Bilbray, who has some experience with it, the San Diego issue, which prompted many of the first discussions of how to establish a Corrections Day process. Welcome to all of you, and thank you very much for your effort and time in working on developing this new process. Mr. DeLay, would you please share with us your view? You've got enormous experience in the problems with the regulatory area and how this process might aid us in that, trying to eliminate those problems.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I really thank you and the other chairman, Mr. Dreyer, and the full committee chairman, Mr. Klinger, and Mr. Solomon, the ranking members, for beginning the process of Corrections Day and putting all this together. I was really excited when this idea was first raised in a leadership meeting with the Speaker, as I immediately thought it would be the perfect way to deal with the myriad of rules and regulations that are unduly costly or simply make no sense. You know, the size of government has reached unbelievable proportions. And it's an unfortunate fact that the average American had to work full-time last year until July the 10th just to pay for the cost of government taxation, mandates, and regulations. What this means is that 52 cents out of every family's hard-earned dollar went to the government, either directly or indirectly. The governments of this country got to spend the majority of the American family's hard-earned dollars. On November the 8th, the American people sent a message to Washington. I feel very strongly that they voted for a smaller, less intrusive government. The House began to address this mandate to reduce the burden of government by passing a number of regulatory reform bills earlier this year, and the Senate is very prepared to follow suit. However, while we're making significant changes to the process by which regulations are promulgated, there is still the arguably even bigger problem of regulations that are currently on the books but shouldn't be and are encroaching on people's lives every day. Many of these are just hard to believe. Under the Clean Air Act, one can end up in jail for filling out a form incorrectly. You can be forced to pay $600,000 for failing to fill out a federal form, even if you've complied with an identical state law. OSHA requires employers to provide detailed safety information and training regarding the use of such hazardous substances as diet soda, Joy dishwashing liquid, and chalk. You can face a grand jury if you harm a protected falcon, even if you do so to save a chicken that the falcon is in the process of killing in your front yard. One can be criminally convicted of contaminating wetlands for moving 2 truckloads of dirt. OSHA can fine a roofer for chewing gum while on the job. The federal government can hold up progress on a residential project in order to protect a wetland that is 6/10,000ths of an acre, or about the size of a ping pong table. Some of these examples come from the Heritage Foundation's book that all of you have received in your packet of information, and the speaker referred to, called Red Tape in America, Stories from the Front Line. I highly recommend it, as it documents regulatory horror stories from numerous federal agencies and departments, demonstrating clearly how the federal regulatory system has gone way too far. Giving the federal government the benefit of the doubt, I assume it's not intentionally trying to wreak havoc on people's lives. Nonetheless, the American people shouldn't have to continue to suffer the consequences of poorly written or poorly implemented rules and regulations. My colleagues, Corrections Day is not a gimmick. It's a real opportunity to right wrongs. All across the country, Americans are fed up with a system that is overly intrusive, unreasonable, and excessively costly. It's wonderful to see that in a general sense, both Democrats and Republicans alike have reached a consensus that the federal government has grown far bigger than was ever intended and needs to be cut back. So I beg you to take this opportunity to address one aspect of the problem and create a process by which we can repeal these most egregious, oppressive, and ridiculous regulations that the government has promulgated. And I thank you for your consideration, and I urge your support for creating a Corrections Day.
Thank you very much, Mr. DeLay. Appreciate your efforts in that regard enormously. Mrs. Vokanovich, you have thought about this a great deal and studied the issue of how we can proceed. Would you please share with us your vision for how Corrections Day would work?
Thank you very much, Chairman McIntosh, and I want to add my thanks to Chairman Dreyer and the other members of both the subcommittees and the full committees, and thank you for holding this hearing today. This is an idea whose time has come, and I can attest to that fact that there's a great deal of public support for the Corrections Day concept. We've been flooded with requests for legislation, and every meeting that I attend, I'm told what a great idea Corrections Day is. And I think it's more important than ever that we in Congress show that government really does work and that we're relevant to the day-to-day lives of Americans. Corrections Day offers this body a chance to show that we can react to real needs in a timely manner. After reviewing the options and talking with many constituents and fellow members of Congress, I'm more convinced than ever of the need for a rapid response system for misguided government. It's important that we develop a means to address obviously silly, redundant government regulations in a rapid fashion. The Congress does not currently have a procedure designed to fix the little annoyances of government that drive the average person crazy. Our only option is to await a technical corrections bill or reauthorization of the program. In many cases, this is an unacceptable delay. Our constituents simply don't understand why they must wait 5 years for a bill to correct what seems to them a minor item, and frankly, I don't really understand it myself. As chairman of the steering committee appointed by the Speaker to establish Corrections Day, I'd like to share with you some of the committee's conclusions. Our recommendation to this committee is to provide a procedure that streamlines the process of correcting obvious problems with a minimum of delay in a bipartisan manner. Corrections Day should avoid far-reaching and highly controversial items. The intent of Corrections Day is not to replace debate and lengthy study of complex issues when it is needed. We also don't want to tread on the jurisdiction of standing committees. I believe there is a middle ground available which will allow us to meet these criteria. I can tell you with my brief experience chairing the Steering Committee on Corrections Day that people in our country want us to take action on these trifles without excuse and without delay. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to give you my input, and I hope that you all will consider very seriously doing something about legislating and Legislative Corrections Day. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Vukanovich. Mr. Zeliff has been very active in attempting to adopt a corrections procedure in the A to Z legislation, and I think that experience has granted him a great deal of wisdom in this matter as well. Mr. Zeliff?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, would like to thank you and Mr. Dreyer, Mr. Solomon, Mr. Klinger for your leadership in doing something that is long overdue. Frankly, I think the Speaker has a great gem of an idea, and you know what we have to do, our challenge is how do you make this idea work? And I think this is the kind of an idea that will get us into the 20th century before the 20th century is over. And it's a kind of like cleaning out our closets. And we need to change or break the culture, and this is a process that will challenge us to do it better. It focuses on our mistakes. It gives us the opportunity to make the system more efficient. Some folks on the other side of the aisle may be rightly concerned by bringing out such things as careful consideration of substance, sound backing, and clear rationale, pointing out our job of oversight, and obviously this all needs to be maintained in a very accountable way. Our intent is to provide an efficient process to allow us to be accountable to do our work more efficiently. And I think that's the key here. As we look to the future, we need to make all the things that we do much more efficient than we've done in the past. We've got to figure out a way to put those things on a fast track where we can, in this particular case, provides a focus, then we can then therefore be held for our results. Some of the things that I picked up in my 10 town meetings in the last 3 weeks, government is out of control. Government is not being held accountable. We have overreached and outreached and to a point where we need to sit back and look at some of the things we've done. Certainly the IRS lifestyle audit is a good example. Superfund is another example. We can go on and on. My idea on A to Z last year was originally intended to do A to Z on spending, A to Z on regulatory reform, A to Z on regulatory reform, and A to Z on tax loopholes. This, frankly, is great because it addresses it in a very orderly way. It goes through the committee process, goes through the rules, gives everybody input. It's a bipartisan approach, and as we tried to do before, and I think it'll help us get to where we want to go. As a small businessman, just to put that perspective to work, we had an incentive program. We gave people rewards and money for coming up with changing our culture, changing the stupid way we've been doing business, making it more efficient. Obviously, the savings then we were willing to share with them. So I think it's about time that we
look for opportunities on how to be more efficient. The Corrections Day concept is a great idea. Hopefully that we can, both sides of the aisle, come up with the way, the procedures to make it fair, bipartisan, and very effective, because I think it's a way for all of us to somehow be able to do our work much more efficiently. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zolliff. Let me now turn to one of my fellow freshmen, representative from San Diego, Mr. Bilbray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank you and the other chairman and the chairwoman from the proud state of Nevada for leading the charge at just reviewing where we want to go with this. And I would have to say I speak today on this issue, what we call the San Diego situation or the fiasco. I'd like to say the tragedy. I think that I need to point out I speak for the entire delegation of the House of Representatives who come from the county of San Diego, a county that has a population twice that of Nevada, a size of about Kansas. And both Democrat and Republicans totally support the concept that we need correction of a well-intentioned but misguided federal regulation. It is a bipartisan issue, not only from the federal point of view, but even Democrats like Senator Steve Peets, who strongly support this. And, Mr. Chairman, I need to point out that I speak not as somebody who operated a sewer system in San Diego, but as somebody who operated the public health department, the environmental health department, for 20 years. I've been working on the pollution and the regulatory problems in San Diego, and I come from the position of trying to protect the public health. And the frustration of running into federal regulations that not only do not encourage public health, but can at times stop you or divert you from addressing major public health problems. Mr. Chairman, as of today, there is over 30 million gallons of raw sewage pouring across the Mexican border and closing the beaches of South San Diego County. My children were not allowed to surf on our beaches that we live only 6 blocks from. I had to drive them an hour north to be able to find a place that I felt comfortable with having my children surf. The federal bureaucracy has failed the environment in San Diego County. And at the same time that a foreign government and the federal bureaucracy has ignored this problem, one that has been allowed to occur through the federal inaction and a wink of the eye and say, go ahead, you can dump sewage for the next few days. The same thing is that we've had all this attention about something that anyone and everyone who has really researched the San Diego outfall issue has said that it is the law is inconsistent, the technical interpretation law is inconsistent with the intent. The fact is, this issue with the secondary sewage mandate of San Diego was not something that was brought to me by the people of the city of San Diego. It was brought to me by a man called Roger Revelle. And those of you who do not know Mr. Revelle, or Dr. Revelle, did not know him, he was the director, the senior member at the Scripps Institute of Oceanography. He also happened to be the individual you might remember developed a concept called the greenhouse effect. It's somebody who has pretty good environmental credentials. And the fact is that when we looked at the federal mandate to go to secondary sewage, and when the studies were done of the environmental impact of fulfilling the letter of the law, it became quite obvious to not only those of us in the environmental health point of view, but those of us who have been involved in the environmental activism, that the damage that was going to be created by initiating the law was greater than doing nothing at all. And that was a major concern. We have tried to raise awareness that the fact that the law, the intent of the law, was not being followed. It has been a hard struggle. And let me tell you, as somebody who was on the other side of this issue before, we kept hearing at the local level, we know that this law is ridiculous, but Congress has mandated that we do this. And the bureaucracy said, we don't have a choice. We're stuck with what Congress forced on us. So unless you can go to Congress and try to change those guys or those people's attitude, we're just stuck with this. And it's stupid, it's ridiculous, and it's environmentally damaging. I would have to say, Mr. Chairman, it's much like a situation, I don't believe it's like cleaning out the closet. My wife would testify we never do that in my room. I would equate it to the fact that this is a 1972 vehicle. It was great. It was up to date when we adopted it. It was best for the science at the time. But we now have new science, and we not only have a right to put in new spark plugs, a new carburation system, a new injector system, a new catalytic converter, maybe even a seat belt. But we have a responsibility to do that. And I know there are the purists that say, no, leave it the way it was in 1972, don't change it. But I think that we're talking about a situation here that not only will save the taxpayers, millions of dollars, but also will clean up the environment. But let me just say one thing else. Probably more important than even money or the environment, for those of us here in Washington, it may do something very radical, and that is it may institute a degree of confidence that we really can respond to reality and reflect reality. And I think it's something we really want to do. I want to make sure that we draw the federal attention away from the letter of the law and the misguided intentions, that we tune up and we use a new spark plug, we use a new carburation to make it run better and more cost effective. But I also want the federal agencies to address the real environmental problems, not just what they think we're mandating from Washington. I don't think you wanted to mandate stupidity. The citizens don't understand why the federal government is mandating it. And I think if we respond to this, it will work, it'll be appropriate. And I think that it's something that we can all be very proud of. Dr. Revelle is no longer with us today. He passed away last year. And members of Congress, I'd like to just say, if there was anything we could do, this could be the Revelle bill to be able to straighten this mess out for the environment and for our children. And as he said to me a week before he passed away, he said, Brian, if you do anything else, bring some sanity to this stupid situation. Change the mandate and make it reflect science and the environment, not bureaucracy and regulation. And the question we have before us, those of us that are fighting for environmental battles, is the regulation more important than the environment? And if the environment's what it's important, we not only have the right to change that regulation, we have the responsibility to do it. And we have to have the guts to do the right thing on this item. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bilbray. Let me ask Mr. DeLay and the other members of the panel, I know you've all got busy schedules. Do you have time for a few questions, or do you need to?
Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind, any questions that would be coming to me, I have a leadership meeting that started 20 minutes ago, and I need to be moving along.
Okay.
Mr. DeLay leaves. I hope he'd let some of us ask him some questions. I mean, the idea of hearing is two-way.
I didn't say I wouldn't answer questions.
Okay. You just have a leadership hearing. Why don't we proceed quickly to the questions? I've got one. The thing that I keep puzzling through in my mind is the relationship of this process to the committee process generally. And perhaps being a freshman, I'm naive to this, but it always struck me that it would be possible to have the committees view this as something that empowered them as an additional opportunity to bring legislation to the floor. I was wondering if you or the other members would comment on that generally, and how you see this relating to the regular business that the committees would be doing.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, I can speak to that. I think this, as the chairman so rightly puts, this empowers particularly subcommittees to really look at what is going on, particularly in those agencies that they may have oversight responsibilities for. It also puts an extra burden on those subcommittees to respond to complaints by American citizens to abuses that they feel are being perpetrated on them by the federal agencies. I also might speak to the fact that I hope that the procedure will consider the notion, as I think one of the panel has alluded to, the notion of no amendments on this kind of bill, particularly as we go through the procedure of working out some sort of process with the Senate. You know, I have been here 10 years, and I have received time and time again the excuse by chairmen of subcommittees or full committees that we just can't address this particular problem because it would open up the entire Clean Air Act. Or we can't address the OSHA problem because it would open up the entire big policy decision that's been made by Congress. This is a way to rifle shot particular problems and it is also a way to empower committees to do the things that their constituents are calling them to do.
Thank you, Mr. DeLay. Any other comment from the other panel members on that? Mr. Peterson.
Chairman, Mr. DeLay, first of all, there's a number of us on this side that are interested in helping you. If you want to expand your task force or whatever it is, we'd be happy to work with you on that.
If I could respond,
Yeah.
This is a task force that was appointed by the Speaker, but that's an excellent suggestion, and I will take it to the Speaker.
Thank you.
Yes, I might tell you, Mr. Peterson, that's one of the things that we've recommended is a bipartisan advisory committee, and we think that there are just as many Democrat members who are as disturbed as we are about some of the silly legislation or regulations.
Second thing, just follow up a little bit on the chairman's observations here. From what I've heard of this, frankly, I'm a little skeptical that much is going to change. I'm going to say something here that might irritate some folks, but I think to some extent this problem is caused because the committees don't legislate in as much detail as I think they should, and they turn too much over to the agencies, and that's what gets us in this trouble. I'm a little skeptical to believe that the committees are going to change the process all that much if we just give them some other title or whatever. Has there been any consideration given to having some other committee have somewhat of a hammer or be able to, for example, maybe this committee or a subcommittee, being able to push that or set some kind of process where we could force the committee to deal with some of these things when they won't? I frankly think unless we have some kind of a hammer or some kind of other way to go at this, that we're going to get stalemated within the committee process. Have you looked at that at all?
I'm sure that Chairman Vukanovich can speak to this, but yes, we've considered that. That's why we set up this task force as sort of eventually being a screening process, not a committee, but a process that would drive or call to the attention a committee that may not or may want to be reluctant in considering a particular idea as a speaker's tool to sort of encourage committees to take up a particular issue. I think, frankly, that when the committees find this expedited procedure to be helpful in taking care of a lot of problems that they particularly don't want to take care of in a huge reauthorization bill or a huge policy type bill, I think they will be eager to do so. And I might finish by saying this leadership of the majority is very interested, and as exhibited by the Speaker coming here to testify, in correcting a lot of these dumb type regulations, and will be urging a lot of committees to be doing a lot of work in this regard.
If I could just, but you haven't considered, this is the Government Reform Committee that we serve on. We have jurisdiction in every area. You haven't considered giving that committee additional authority to actually have kind of a discharge petition process. In other words, if the committee won't move and we hold hearings and decide that that committee is entrenched or turf protecting or whatever, that we could actually bring that to the floor over their
I think that's something that
or some kind of process
joint,
like that.
I think that's something that this joint committee should suggest when it designs the procedure, and it's something that should be considered by both leaderships, the minority and the majority. But it's part of designing the procedure.
Well, and that's why we think that a formal structure enhances the visibility of actually this process in a very powerful way. And we certainly don't want to take any of the jurisdiction away from the committees. But we think that with the guidelines that we will propose, that it certainly will be a way to take care of these small things without upsetting, for instance, the clean air and clean water and so forth. But we don't want to take away any of the committee structure, but at the same time, we think if we actually have a structure that's set up and it's corrections calendar, you know, we do have suspensions, really it's consent calendar. We think that this will be an opportunity to keep the committee going.
I just think that you're being too nice. Frankly, I think we ought to have some with a hammer with some of these committee.
Well, maybe
I
you
think they've
can
caused some of this problem, and frankly, I don't care if we stir them up a little bit. I think it needs to be done.
maybe you can help us with
yeah.
those details.
Thank you very much, Mr. Peterson. Does anyone have additional questions for Mr. DeLay? Mr. Waxman.
Mr. DeLay, I appreciated your testimony, and I know you have to leave, but you went through a litany of examples that sound on the surface to be matters of concern to all of us. But we've heard lots of anecdotes this session of Congress that turn out not to have been accurate. We heard that baby teeth weren't going to be returned from one agency and that buckets were going to have holes in them under government regulations. We've heard about some guy in Florida that was required to do something. When we've looked below the surface, turns out some of these claims that sound so ridiculous just weren't accurate. It wasn't full information. That's why I'm pleased that the Speaker told us this morning that the committees of jurisdiction will have a chance to hold hearings, because we wouldn't want to make laws based on misinformation or anecdotes that turn out to be accurate. I think it's important that the committees that have expertise deal with the issues, and I have no problem, and I don't think there's anything that prohibits us now to deal with specific finite questions without having to go into the whole Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, or whatever. So I did want to make that point to you, but the question I have of you is, why should we restrict this only to foolish actions by government agencies? Why not areas where the public needs to be protected and we'll all agree about it? For example, if some of these broad sweeping laws that are being proposed and in fact passed the House are passed in their present form, I believe we're going to find a situation where that the consumers are going to be faced with toxic substances that none of us would ever want to see them exposed to, that can do a great deal of harm. Will we be able to put on the corrections calendar to correct the fact that there is not regulation that's going to be necessary? Or, for example, I've been very involved in the smoking issue. I don't see that there's any reason why cigarette smoking, which is the leading cause of disease and death in this country, isn't regulated. Will we be able to come in and say that there ought to be a clear regulation to prevent the pushing of cigarettes on kids in violation of the law? Will it just be one way to stop government action, or will it be to encourage government action as well when it's necessary to protect the public?
Well, first off, I agree with you that this, as everyone has alluded to, that this should be an open process, hearings should be held, and you should get to the bottom of any sort of complaint that comes from American citizens and our constituents. I would say, and Mr. Waxman, you've been here long enough to understand that when you've got the votes, run with it. If you've got the votes, run with it under the procedure. But I just say to you, this is a hearing to work all those kinds of issues out. And if you are so inclined to have it the other way, and you have the votes in committee and on the floor to allow that sort of procedure, then that might be good. But this whole idea is to react to agencies that legislate through regulation, and in some cases step beyond the bounds of the intent of the legislation and are preying on the American people, not some proactive type of regulation, wanting one to be put into place.
If something is really foolish, if a government agency is doing something improper, there should be no question that all of us ought to stand behind trying to stop that from happening. On the other hand, if some harm is going to occur to the American people and we need government to step in, I would hope there'd be no disagreement over that as well, and that we have an opportunity to deal with it. I just hope we don't get in a situation, Mr. DeLay, and I'll say it quite openly and frankly, where we have special interest groups, lobbyists, campaign contributors screaming loudly and getting their issue taken care of, sometimes even at the expense of the public, because they've been able to try to get their supporters to advance their cause in a way where they wouldn't otherwise stand the scrutiny of hearings and legitimate process, and so they're on an accelerated timetable. I assume you wouldn't want that either.
I would not want that either, and I share the gentleman's concern. That's why I do support an open process and hearing process and a normal process that this legislative body goes through. But also, and I might respond, since you brought it up, your opening remarks, you know, we've all used the term special interests, but it usually means people that disagree with us. It's always a special interest.
Campaign contributors. I'm willing to confine it to campaign contributors, and I don't think that the powerful special interest groups that give lots of money to office holders for their campaigns or their other political efforts ought to have a greater say over legislation than ordinary Americans who can't afford lobbyists and can't afford to give big contributions.
Neither should I, but if I could finish my statement, Mr. Waxman, I consider people that come and avail themselves and tell me some of the problems that they're having in their day-to-day life. I consider them constituents, I consider them Americans, and they have interests that are very special to their concerns. Surely you're not suggesting that you have never met with or received advice or was assisted in writing legislation by such groups that have interests that are special concerns to theirs, as Greenpeace or Environmental Defense Fund or ACLU or labor unions or Nader's Public Citizen Group or trial lawyers or any other liberal organizations that have special concerns of what's going on in this Congress.
Yeah, well, Mr. DeLay, I've never had them in the room drafting the legislation. Mr. Chairman, I have questions of some of the other panelists. Are we going to have a chance to go back over that? Yeah, but soon I want to see if I'm going to have time to ask.
Yes, there'll be time for additional questions for the other members of this panel.
My colleague.
I thank my friend for yielding, and I'd simply respond to the question that has been raised about special interest involvement here by saying that the Speaker addressed that in his testimony by making it clear that we want to publicize to the American people that this Corrections Day process is one which is going to allow them to come forward not simply with a gripe about the operations of the federal government, but with a vehicle that we are going to put forward that will allow them to redress the concerns that exist there. And so I think that the Speaker has very adequately pointed to the fact that the design for this is for the average American to feel as if he or she has an opportunity to step forward and deal with a concern that they have. And I thank my friend for yielding.
I just hope we can deal with the problems of actions that people complain about, but inactions as well that they complain about by the federal government, because those two are also questions that affect the public interest. I'll look forward to a chance to question the other members of the panel, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Do any other members of either of the subcommittees have questions for Mr. DeLay? Yes, Mrs. Collins.
Mr. DeLay, I have a question. I have here a list that's called Corrections Inventory, and on this list there are several items, about 32 of them. One of them is Individuals with Disabilities Act revisions, and it says under that apply Federal Administrative Procedures Act, state option to combine IDEA fund with other federal funds, authority for states to use 10% of IDEA funds for non-categorical supports. Another one says something about 50 CFR 930 requires agencies to review competence and physical qualifications of all employees who operate vehicles. Another one, Title 4E, client eligibility requirements for AFDC, etc. My question is, have you seen this list?
I have not seen that list.
Would you have any idea where it might have come from, how it might have been developed, who was consulted, or any?
I haven't seen the list. I don't know where it came from. I don't know how you got it. I just suggest that I don't even know the meaning of the list because we don't have a Corrections Day procedure yet, and we've already testified that anything that would come to the floor under a Corrections Day procedure would go through the normal open legislative process.
So you have no list, you don't already have a list of things that you might want to have show up on Corrections Day?
I've got plenty of lists in my own mind of being a businessman for 20 years. I've got a list as long, in fact, I refer to you again to the Heritage Foundation book that I had a lot of input in, the Red Tape in America, and many other lists that are out there that we ought to look at as candidates for a Corrections Day procedure.
Well, Mr. Kellogg just grabbed his microphone. I'm sure Mr. Zellick wants to say something.
No, I just wish that, and you know, I think your intent is well justified, but I think what we have is a gem of idea here to make us more efficient. How do we focus on mistakes so that we can get beyond the mistakes, get the things that are holding us up from progress to be more successful? And so whether you have a list or everybody has a list, what's that? I mean, I think what we need to do is set up a process so that we can process those lists.
Well,
and there may not be any finalists on your list.
Excuse me for interrupting you, but I am concerned if there are lists that are already there, because no Democrats have been on this committee that has been, on the steering committee that has been set up. I'd also like to know where these lists are generated from, because I want to know who's doing it. Some of the witnesses here, either you or the speaker, has said that people are calling your offices and they're talking about the things that have to go on, that have to be looked at. Nobody's called my office, and I don't know about other members, and I can't speak for only for the 7th Congressional District of Illinois. But I want to know where these people are who are asking that all of these things be reviewed, because they haven't been calling me.
Mrs. Collins, would you yield for 1 second?
Yeah.
Am I to understand what Mr. DeLay and Mr. Zelliff were saying is there is no...
I think they can talk for themselves. I mean, I asked them a question. Are you going to ask them a question, or what are you going to do?
I just want a clarification on your question. Are you asking, is there an official list, or are these just things that are advisory?
What I'm concerned about is whether or not, where these lists are coming from.
And are they official?
Okay.
And are they official? The answer has already been given there. There is no list, and therefore they are not official. And so where I want to know now is, where are these requests coming from?
Well, you know, the requests can come from the world.
But the world hasn't called me either.
Well, you'll be connected.
We'll be glad to connect your phone, Ms. Collins,
You'll connect
if
me to
it's
the
not
world?
connected. But I can show, I have file cabinets full of requests from constituents as well as people around the country.
People are.
If the gentlelady would yield, I would like to just emphasize what our speaker did say in his opening statement, was that after he spoke to the Governors Association, that he received many, many requests, and I think the first 40 requests came from the Governors Association, including Governor Edgar from
Than the world
Illinois.
At large. Thank you very much for your education.
Can I just add one comment? I don't think there's anybody intending here to exclude anybody. I think what was said before, and I think we may need to re-emphasize it, is that we want to open this up into a bipartisan process. I think that we're talking about doing that and adding Democrats to the process. And certainly anybody that has, I mean, there's no limit to where the ideas come from. Democrats can create good ideas as Republicans can, and I'm sure everybody's input's going to be welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Certainly. Thank you. Mrs. Collins, you might also want to know, over the break, Mr. Peterson and I held a field hearing and heard from several dozen citizens in Indiana, and the staff will be compiling a list from that record of ideas as well, which will be publicly available to everyone.
So there will be an official list.
I don't know that it will be official. These are just testimony, and it will provide ideas that can be considered as the advisory committee goes forward.
And Mr. Chairman, I could also say that I'll be glad to, anybody that contacts me, I will urge them to contact Ms. Collins.
Yeah.
The world. The whole world.
Okay. Mrs. Waldholz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. DeLay, I know you need to leave, but I wanted to raise an issue that I know you've been working on. One of the people who's called me, without me being on the steering committee for Corrections Day or anything else, are people who are dealing with auto emissions testing. And Salt Lake County is currently being faced with draconian penalties by the Environmental Protection Agency if they don't fall into compliance with the INM 240 centralized emission testing program. And the regulation involved completely ignores a program in California that is 1/5 as expensive and over 98% as effective. So I'm getting calls about this. I get calls about lots of other things. People stop me in the grocery store to tell me about problems that they've had. And I think part of the problem that we have had in Congress is that we have not had a mechanism to respond quickly to things that are clearly a problem when they're actually implemented in the public. And so I applaud your efforts to do this. My question for you, Mr. DeLay, and perhaps the other members can address this after you have left, so the other members have an opportunity also to ask you some questions. But where do we find the line between what committees need to handle through the regular legislative process and what kinds of things can we handle through a Corrections Day process? And I'll just ask you, for example, would this kind of EPA testing program be something we could address through a Corrections Day?
I'm glad you brought that up, Ms. Waldhost, because it shows the problem. When I raised the problem about emissions testing in the Clean Air Act, the Environmental Protection Agency wasn't really interested in listening to me. Plus, there were other members. This was last year, and some of the committee chairmen made the statement that we cannot reopen the Clean Air Act by addressing this one particular problem. And then, subsequent to that, the EPA has more or less, I don't know if it's officially, has realized that centralized emissions testing that was proposed, for instance, in Houston, Texas, my hometown, didn't make a lot of sense, but they say, well, we can't do a whole lot about that, that we will be sued if we change certain things to accommodate more convenient and more common sense type approaches to emissions testing. This would be a great candidate that maybe if the EPA is straight with their assessment of going too far, would be supportive of a very expedited process to correct that problem that they see in the Clean Air Act without, quote, opening up the Clean Air Act to a total review.
Thank you, Mr. DeLay. Mr. Bielenson.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just a brief comment, if I may, and I mean this I say this with all respect, because the members of the panel, with the exception of the new gentleman from San Diego, whom I've not had the pleasure of meeting personally, but obviously is a very intelligent and concerned person. The others are all good friends of ours, but to be frank about it, you haven't been very helpful. Your testimony has not been very helpful. You've got the nub of a nice little idea here, but we still have to discuss in some specificity how we handle it, how we're supposed to do this. Mrs. Waldholz asked exactly the kind of question that needs to be asked, a good many more of them along with it, and answered as well. We need some help in how to define the kind of, and how to write the kind of process that we need to accomplish what you all and what we too, I may say, want to accomplish. You know, do we need a new process at all? Maybe, or should we have, as perhaps a couple of people have suggested, at various times today, including perhaps the speaker. I don't mean to be speaking for him, but I think I heard him say this, that we could simply designate a suspension calendar every now and then as a corrections calendar. Maybe that's the best way of doing it. So, do we need a new process entirely? What would be the exact process of handling the corrections bills prior to enabling them to have floor consideration? There are all kinds of ideas about things that need to be corrected, but what we need help on, and which we ask your help in the weeks to come, is how to write a process and to define these concepts in such a way as to make it usable for all of us to accomplish what we all want to accomplish. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
I'd like to try to answer that. I think since we have been talking about just what procedures to use for Corrections Day, and we debated about whether we wanted a corrections calendar or how we wanted to do, whether we do a combination of suspensions in regular order or suspension of the rules or a regular order or monthly corrections package. We looked at all of these, and we are in the process, I suppose that's what this hearing is about, but we recognize that we do need to have some factors that have to be considered in setting priorities, and that's why we're hoping for input on both sides. And I suppose some of the factors are, if we're going to do this, is the legislation controversial? And how many people would support it, and whether it would be Democrats, Republicans, or just what, and the number of people affected. I mean, we're not going to do this for some one person who has a bird in his yard that he doesn't think needs to be there. And also we have to look at criteria about preparation time and the urgency. If you look at some of the people who have, particularly in the West, who have suffered from a lot of the regulations that come down, and when I say the West, I always think about the western states that have public lands, but and and also the savings or the cost. So I think we are in the process of setting down that criteria, and we hope we'll get input from the other members.
Well, I thank the gentlelady, I thank the chairman, and I look forward also to our next panel where we've got some folks who deal with some of the specifics.
I was going to
some
say,
experience, and maybe it's some help to us.
Sure, we're going to be followed by Billy Pitts and some of the others who worked with these procedures over a long period of time. He probably have a lot more expertise than we do on the actual procedures.
I'd just like to just add one little quick thing, Tony. I think that, frankly, most of these issues, I would say almost 100% of them are going to have consensus issues. They're going to have a scale of 0 to 10 of stupidity, and they're going to be in the 10 range. And so the things that we bring together here, people on both sides of the aisle are going to view it as a vehicle of getting things done, cleaning it up, and moving forward. And I don't see it as a big fight. I see it as more of a consensus.
I agree. Let me say just one more thing, if I may, very
Certainly.
briefly, Mr. Chairman, to back up something that our friend Mr. Peterson said earlier. To a certain extent, this is a result of committees not having done their job well enough, not having spent enough time on oversight and so on. Part of the problem is that there are not enough members of this Congress, if I may say so, again with all respect, who settled into the job of legislating and spent enough time in Washington thinking through some of these things, going to hearings or whatever. They're too anxious to go home and make little sound bites and talk about all the things that need to be done without staying here. We've only got 435 members in the House. We need at least a couple of hundred of them working hard, mostly full-time, to accomplish these kinds of things. We're not going to be able to escape it, even if we have this kind of process, because someone around here is going to have to take a serious look at these kinds of matters. And so I hope that this will encourage us to do our committee work.
I just like to say, what we're really talking about, let's do a reality check. The intentions of the legislation, much like we talked of 20, 30 years ago, need to do a reality check every once in a while. If we got people coming, I don't know where the lists come from, but if you got people saying, excuse me, I think there is a gap between the theoretical approach of the legislation and the practical application. And so we bring it out, and we basically shine a light on it and said, is this a reality we meant to create? And if it wasn't, we're going to have to take care of it. So I think it can be very healthy for the people in Washington to finally sort of do a reality check, a performance review, and then see if the law is appropriate. And then also we can fine-tune it to really do what we meant it to do if we find a problem.
Of course, and I was only suggesting, Brian, that we should have been doing a better job of checking on how things are working many years after we first passed them than, in fact, we've been doing.
It's our new reality.
Yes. Yes, Mrs. Wolf.
Of course.
Tony, I agree with you that I think we need to do a better job in our oversight, but I also think we have to acknowledge that part of this program, or this problem, has been created by some very activist agencies who choose to take on the mantle of legislation through regulation. So I think it's a two-pronged problem.
If I might interject, let me say from the standpoint of someone who served on the executive side, that this process and the hearings that it will generate in the committees, I think will have an enormously beneficial effect, and we'll find that there seems to be a huge number of targets of opportunity out there that will find the agencies are actually more responsive to the citizens and ingenious in finding ways of correcting many of the problems their own as the hearing process works. So
we just want to make sure there are hearings in committees.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of merit to that.
In defense of some of the oversight hearings, is if you don't have a process like this, there's no reason to, there's no process by which you can easily correct a problem other than browbeating a bureaucrat or an agency and going through the appropriations process to do so. So
with respect, if you were chairman of a committee, you cared about some particular matter, you could have reported out, you could have gotten the votes to send out a bill, a little rifle shot, as my friend Mr. Waxman has suggested, to correct some of these things if you'd been in a position prior to now, which you hadn't been, to do that. I think committees could have done this. And one good thing about this whole matter, I think, will be to encourage committees to do the kind of work they should have been doing all along, through a specific new process or not.
Thank you very much. Mr. Condit, I note that you had a question for Mr. DeLay.
Actually, because we've taken a lot of time, and I know Mr. DeLay has to leave, I will make it real brief. I just want to say for the record that I think this suggestion is a very constructive suggestion and hope that we can figure out a way to make this work. But I would like the committee, as well as Mr. DeLay and the people interested in this, to take heed to what I think was suggested by the Speaker and members of this panel, and that is that we make this balanced. I don't know if you figure out a way to do a one-for-one, the minority offers one, the majority offers one, but I think it ought to be balanced, and that would be my suggestion, is that we figure out a way to make sure that we get a one-for-one kind of ratio so that the minority and the majority end up with the same thing on the floor. Because there's a lot of us who are interested in doing this, and we don't want to be sort of out of the loop because we don't have access to the task force or to whatever policy we put together. In addition to that, I would encourage some way, Mr. DeLay, you were the speaker, and I know the speaker left to go meet with Mr. Dole, but you know, the House can't unilaterally change federal law or regulations. We need to work out a system that works with the Senate as well. So I think we need to spend a lot of time making sure that happens, because we can have an all-day, two-day session on the floor every month and end up just spinning our wheels if we don't have some sort of arrangement on the Senate side. So that's basically, out of consideration for time, Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to make those comments for the record. It doesn't require a response unless Mr. DeLay wants to respond.
Any response from Mr. DeLay?
Only that I agree with Mr. Condit, and we will consider those, and we are in the process of consulting with the Senate. And you're right, we can't do this without the Senate.
Thank you very much. And thank you particularly, Mr. DeLay, for missing your meeting. Would the other members of the panel mind waiting a few minutes? Mr. Waxman had asked if he had some questions.
Mr. Chairman, I'm perfectly willing to stay. I also have a leadership meeting, the same leadership meeting, but that's fine. I'd be happy to answer Mr. Waxman's questions.
Thank you. Mr. Waxman?
I'll just be late.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be very brief because we've gone over some of these issues, but I do want to, on the point that Mr. Bilbray raised with regard to the San Diego sewer issue, put into the record a letter from our colleague, Congressman Norman Mineta, to the Honorable David Dreyer and the Honorable David M. McIntosh, dated May 1 today, I guess it was yesterday, May 1, 1995. And it's a letter pointing out that this is a more complicated issue than one would think at first glance. And without objection, Mr. Chairman, I'd like unanimous consent to put that letter in the record.
Any objection? Seeing none, the request is granted.
And Mr. Bilbray, I don't feel it would be all that productive to debate these issues with you, but I think there are serious concerns expressed by people that...
Would the gentleman yield 1 second?
Yes.
Would you have any questions for Mrs. Vokanovich?
You know, I don't particularly, except some of the general questions, and as a member of the leadership, if she wouldn't mind just staying one more minute, I'll be brief. I'm sorry. And we should have probably, if I might say, Mr. Chairman, gone through in 5 minutes each of us, and all the panelists could have left, because a lot of the questions of Mr. DeLay were questions that other members of the panel might have addressed. But Mr. Bilbray, the points in Mr. Mineta's letter is that the corrections for San Diego were handled in previous legislation, and that there's an argument that a fundamental problem with San Diego's argument is already provided the relief. Additional legislation might be harmful because they acted on conditions that they get this this waiver, and I just put that out there.
And I would like to say I haven't met with the congressman yet, and I am going to meet, because I think there's some misunderstanding here, where not only are we proposing to continue extensive monitoring. The monitoring system for the outfall has become so extensive that the EPA is now contracted with the city of San Diego to not only monitor for that outfall, but to monitor for the entire northern half of Baja. And Mr. Waxman, I would say this. If the Institute of Science, the Academy of Science, came forward to this body in 1972...
Yeah, Mr. Bilbray, could I just... because I really don't want to get into the issue.
Okay, no. But what I'm saying is, this is a bigger issue. The fact is, if you've got data in science, if we were told in 72 there isn't a problem with sewage, with secondary sewage, there isn't a need for it, we've got the data that says that there is no environmental damage going. I don't think, and I think you agree, if the scientists stood before you and said Congress, it isn't needed, there would not have been any process here. What I'm concerned about is a $1.5 million process that is diverting attentions and resources away from something that everyone in the Environmental Health Department, in the state of California, the EPA, and the local Academy, the Academy of Science National, says isn't a problem, but it's diverting away from true environmental problems. And the question is the process serving the environment? And if the process is not serving the environment, then we have an obligation to change it.
The only thing I would just want to say is that when a federal judge who was appointed by the Reagan administration fined San Diego $3 million for sewage overflows that violated the Clean Water Act, the judge held, quote, "The sewage treatment program in the city has been victimized by a failure of political leadership dating back at least 3 decades. The city has maintained a policy of inaction except when action was literally forced upon it by the federal orders, directives, sanctions, and threats of more severe economic measures. The result is an outrageous record of spills, closures, and distress to residents over sewer backups in their homes, churches, and business," end quote. And Mr. Mineta has written a letter that provides additional detail and expresses strong opposition to this particular corrections legislation. But I do want to ask Mrs.
Wait a second.
It's my time, and I do want to ask Mrs.
Wait.
That was the question.
Mr. Waxman, you can't ask him a question and not let him have a chance to answer.
Mr. Chairman, I didn't ask a question. I simply wanted to point out that Mr. Bilbray, who testified on this subject and said this ought to be a topic for Corrections Day, I did want to point out there are some complications in this issue, some contrary views. It may not be so obvious that this ought to be a correction. I think that in part you're right, that San Diego should be able to get a waiver, but the conditions of the waiver, under what circumstances they ought to get it, is still something that ought to be considered.
Mr. Waxman, can I clarify that?
Mr. Chairman, if I could have additional time to ask other members of the panel questions, I'd be glad to yield time, but I do want to
Mr. Chairman, I'd appreciate that.
Let me just say, yes, you'll have additional time, Mr. Waxman. Mr. Bilbray, let me ask your indulgence for 1 second. I know it's somewhat unfair to make a statement and then not let you respond, but if we could have the other issues come forward and then let you make your statement in response to that, which I'll do as a question.
I'm not trying to cut you off. I'm just simply trying to get to the other questions on this whole Correction Day issue. And maybe the San Diego issue could be fashioned in a way that it ought to move forward on a Corrections Day calendar, but maybe it ought to move forward on another calendar. This is not the only way for us to pass individual pieces of legislation. And there is a Clean Water Act reauthorization that's moving forward as well. But Mrs. Vukanovic, as a member of the leadership, I'm concerned how we distinguish among those issues that are obviously dumb and require correction and those which constitute substantive policy disagreements. Are we going to have an objective criteria, or is it simply going to be 60 votes or 2/3 vote? And if you have the votes, then you call it dumb, and if you don't have the votes, there's a serious policy disagreement. Or do you think that will just be ironed out in the hearings?
We hope, Mr. Waxman, that we will have an equal advisory committee, if that's the word. I'm not sure just how we'll set that up, but both Democrats and Republicans in an equal number. We hope that we're not going to pick something out of the air that is the most controversial thing that you can think of and then say we're going to try to pass this. I don't think that's our intent. But I think all of us will agree that there are many just dumb regulations that are being implemented and shouldn't be. Obviously, I don't think we're going to be able to pass something if we don't have an agreement on what the criteria are, and I think that's what we're in the process of trying to set up.
I've seen a lot of dumb things pass.
Oh, I have too.
So this isn't a question whether the votes are there or not. The question is whether we're going to have an expedited procedure for something that's going to be called dumb, but it's not without controversy.
I would hope that that isn't our reason for existence.
You're envisioning a committee, Democrats and Republicans, to oversee what goes on this calendar?
That's my intention.
Okay, that's an interesting and helpful clarification. Would tax provisions be open to be put on the table?
I have not we haven't really set down exactly what would qualify, but again, I think it has to have the input of whether it has to be hearings or however we have to do it. Yes, it certainly, tax provisions could be, if you're talking about how the IRS sets up their criteria of when they audit people. But in any event, we are hoping that what we will do is have provisions that everyone agrees that are dumb.
I appreciate that. And then the last question I have of you, or Mr. Zelloff or Mr. Bilberry, whichever one wants to respond. one of our later witnesses is going to point out that a lot of businesses are trying to make decisions based on what the law appears to be.
Well,
So would correction days run the risk of creating substantial disruptions for some sectors of the economy or for enforcement of the laws if we rush to make changes on a piecemeal manner?
Well, I think you're talking about, would it be retroactive? Is that what you're talking about?
No, I think people make decisions as to what the law is going to be for the next couple of years, and if we suddenly change it for next year.
I think there's an issue here where you have certain agencies or in geographic location, there'll be an appropriate interpretation of the law, and then another location, there'll be an outrageous interpretation of the law, and the business community and the private sector's out there saying, which one is the legislative intent? So this thing works the other way too, Mr. Waxman. It's a fact that sometimes it's site-specific, and you'll have business people going, wait a minute, I know over here where I've got another state, they do it totally different, and so they're confused. There could be a possibility, and I appreciate you don't want to change the rules on the community, but there are places where you clarify the rules because they're getting conflicting reports.
This is a businessman. I would say to you that the risk is the other way, that most of the stuff that will be corrected will be beneficial for small businesses and large businesses alike. And the fact that they can't plan, they'll be happy to have the corrections rather than the lack of planning.
A lot of dumb things are written into law because one business wants to have a competitive advantage over another, and that's really what I was thinking about. And once we start changing that, it can have consequences. Mr. Bilbray, I hope you had a chance to see Mr. Minetta's letter, to put it in the record. I want to give you a chance to say a few words about it, but the only reason I raised it is I didn't want it to go uncontroverted, that this isn't an issue that is without controversy.
Okay, I think to clarify the fact that...
One second, Mrs. Vukanovich needs to leave. Is there any other questions for her? Any other questions for Mrs. Vukanovich or Mr. Zeller? Thank you very much. Mr. Bilbray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Waxman, the letter clarifies why there shouldn't be a controversy, because if you read it, it was the Brewster case, and just to point out, I was one of the lead witnesses for the Sierra Club lawsuit against EPA and the City of San Diego, and I got the County of San Diego Public Health Department to join with the Sierra Club on this ruling. When Judge Brewster made that ruling, if you read it again, and if the Congressman Mineta would read this, he'd understand it supports the correction. Because what the judge said, Judge Brewster, he said that where the city had been had failed was in upgrading the collection lines and the pumping facilities that were causing the backups, and that there was more environmental damage done because they were not taking care of infrastructure that was real. Rather, they were responding to federal mandates on the outfall. And if you read that letter again, you'll notice the outfall is not even mentioned in that. That supports the concept that I'm saying, is that somebody who, really is tired of having to see if my beach is polluted, that the interpretation of the federal law by the EPA is perpetuating and helping to encourage this problem. That was Brewster's statement, and it was against not just the City of San Diego, it was against the EPA's secondary mandate at the same time. So what I'm saying is, when I meet with Congressman Mineta, that's why I can point out that what is being, what they think that's being said is actually supporting the fact that we need a corrections here, and Judge Brewster, more than anyone else in this statement, supports the correction on this problem.
I guess one of the essential points that you'll be discussing with Mr. Mineta and others is if you give a permanent waiver to San Diego, you remove the ability of EPA to not just that can monitor, but to move with the kind of history that San Diego has, which is not admirable, to make sure that they do take action with sewage disposal that's going to protect the public.
What we're planning to do is this, and I think that we may disagree about the relationship of government and the citizens at large. What we're saying is that people are not guilty till proven innocent, and that every 5 years you should not be dragged before a court and forced with 26 pounds of documentation to prove what scientists say will not happen in the foreseeable future. But it will include the monitoring, as you said, constant monitoring. So all we're proposing to do is changing that the process follows function, that we protect the environment, and that the resources be used to protect the environment, not the millions of dollars and the 26 pounds of what used to be a forest every 5 years just because the procedure. That's all we're saying. The same monitoring, in fact, the monitoring agency will be the EPA. The EPA is paying the city of San Diego to do it because they do it better than the EPA. This has all been included in our strategy, and this will be discussed as we come up. All we're saying is that if science and the Academy of Science says there isn't a problem and there's no foreseeable problem, then we should monitor the problem and only bring it up for trial, only bring it up for processing if the monitoring detects there's a problem.
The disagreement we have is not a broad philosophical one. I think the disagreement, and it's one we need to discuss, but the disagreement seems to be that, according to a judge, the sewage treatment program in San Diego has had, quote, a failure of political leadership, and the judge indicates that there's been an outrageous record of spills, closures, and distress to residents over sewer backups in their homes, churches, and businesses. I think that
nothing to do with the outfall.
I think that we need to make sure that whatever we're going to provide for, that we don't simply trust San Diego to do what's right if they have a record where they have not acted responsibly.
Again, this judge's statement was to EPA and the city of San Diego, and that is why he was distressed. And I think that we need to clarify that these words actually are indictment of the federal government with the city of San Diego at that time, because they were being following federal mandates on this issue, and that is why the judge was so vocal on this issue. And I say that as somebody who sat through these through the trial.
I yield to just for a moment, if I may, Mr. Chairman. What may be even more relevant, I say to my friend from Los Angeles and to our friend from San Diego, our newfound friend from San Diego, is that this clearly is a complicated and controversial matter that may not really lend itself quite so easily as we were led to believe at the outset to being part of a new process. In a sense, that's the relevant consideration here. There are two sides to this matter. The ranking minority member of the full committee is very much opposed to it, although hopefully you can change his mind, Brian. But it may not, as I just said, be something which can easily be resolved in the way that the Speaker and some of his friends have in mind.
To be blunt, the real controversy here is there a flaw in the Clean Water Act as we passed it in 1972, and does it need to be corrected, at least when the evidence goes the other way? And
we certainly need a hearing to find out the answer to that.
And, well, I'm saying all you need to do right now is to read the report that we commissioned as a federal government, the Academy of Science, that says the law does not reflect the science and should be changed.
I don't mean to be picking on you, Brian, or your suggestion. I'm just suggesting that a lot of these things, which may make a lot of sense and may in fact make a lot of sense, but seem to make a lot of sense to the proponents, may be far more complicated and controversial once you get into them, and may defy our trying to squeeze them into some kind of new simplified process.
And I appreciate that. I just get, I guess the frustration of those of us that are living with environmental problems is that we forget sometimes that people are wedded to the legislation even more than they are the environment sometimes, because that's what we see here in Washington. We don't see the pollution on the beaches of the Pacific.
Be patient, because you're much closer to the solution than you've ever been before.
Let me just say, I think this is extremely helpful to us as a real-life example of something that may or may not work under this new process. I want to now move on to discuss further issues in the question of the process of Corrections Day. Are there any other questions for Mr. Wilbray or Mr. Fox?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did want to ask a couple more, if I could, to Congressman Bilbray. He obviously has a great deal of expertise in the area. By having the Corrections Day, obviously, we're going to be able to move towards fast-tracking some reforms in Congress that you've been discussing. In fact, you've discussed prior to the hearing. Do you see Corrections Day as focusing on legislation or more on regulations and policies?
Well, I think that you need to look at policies, and what you'll find is many times the agencies will say, we're just following the rules you told us to in legislation, and you have to respond to it. So I think that obviously you will start up the path by starting at the smallest denominator, the agency on the street, and then you see if there's a pattern. Are the people with the Clean Air Act enforcing it as interpreting it the same way in a non-attainment area in Pennsylvania as a non-attainment area in California? And if they are, then you can follow it up. If they're not, then you start saying, now, is it a site-specific issue, and do we need to modify it based on the way the regs are being enforced as opposed to the base legislation? So I think there are going to be times you're going to run right up to the base legislation, like we did with the Clean Water Act. that we were told again and again, we know that this is not reasonable, but Congress is not reasonable, and you have to go to Congress to change this. We can't do it. And even the judge said that.
Well, how do you handle the situation which we had in Pennsylvania where we had incorrect data by the agencies being applied to the businesses, and therefore the trip reduction was going to be mandatory and causing great economic harm without great environmental benefit?
Well, I think that what you're saying right there and a lot of the things, we need to make a decision as policymakers. Is the process more important than the product? Is our gold expendable because we designed or we are part of, it's the federal process. The federal process is important. What I'm here to say is the federal process is only viable as long as the product it produces is viable. And that when we get down here, the more you look into it, you need to do this reality check of, is it doing what we intended it to do? And I think there are times you're going to find, no, it isn't. There's times you can see we can do more. And I'll tell you, as Mr. Waxman pointed out with tobacco, my father died from tobacco consumption, but maybe we ought to talk about minor girls smoking in the tunnel of the Capitol to set up some credibility with the American people. Now, where we have minor smoking on premises, nobody talks about that. But we'll talk about somebody else, and maybe we need to start looking at our own process to develop credibility, and I think that's probably even a bigger issue than sewage or air pollution or all this other stuff.
Chairman, if I may, do you think that by reason of your own investigation on the issues that you've had prior to your being part of Congress, do you think that we've delegated too much authority to federal agencies?
I think you have. I think that what's happening is that in a Jeffersonian democracy where citizens' rights are premier or lease are very high, that government now places individuals in a position that they do not have rights unless they can prove that it will not impact the federal agenda or the state agenda. And I think that we have a major problem with the fact that the bureaucracy is dictating to the citizen, that government is dictating to the individual rather than the way our founding fathers meant it to be, and that is the individual should dictate in a group to government, and government should be responding to the individuals cumulatively speaking, not asking individuals to respond to a monolithic government.
The challenge I think we have, finally speaking, is whether or not we need to look at agencies one by one as far as corrections, or whether we talk about a sunset review process whereby an agency or bureau or department is no longer effectuating the original goals for which it was intended, or duplicating state procedures, whether or not that should be sunset.
Well, Mr. Fox, I think you need to say one thing. Is the private citizen innocent until proven guilty, or is he or she guilty until a federal agency finds them innocent? And I think the issue here, much like with the San Diego sewage issue, is that there's no court in law. In fact, Federal Judge Brewster said that the jury, the verdict of the Congress of the United States was not appropriate, was immoral, and should be changed. And so the jury has already said that government's wrong on some of these issues. What we need to do is to get back to the fact that it should never get to that point. People should have the right to individual behavior until such time as they're found guilty violating some kind of general code.
I think both of these committees, the Rules and Government Reform, are going to move ahead and try to make those changes for reform. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Fox. Are there any other questions? And if not, we'll move on to the next
Thank you,
panel.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bilbray. Let me call forward our next panel of witnesses. On it are both Mayor Roger Coronet of Richmond, Indiana, who is a good friend of mine from my district, and I'm delighted he's been here. As we were going through several of our town meetings, he brought forward various examples where regulations just didn't make sense from his perspective as a mayor of a city in Indiana, and also Mr. James Herr, who is the chairman and CEO of Herr Foods Incorporated. If I remember correctly, Mr. Herr has published a little booklet called Chips of Wisdom, which I enjoyed very much and still have on my desk. It is an excellent example of what the private sector can do to further knowledge in our country.
That's the non-caloric version.
That's right. All dietary.
Thank you.
Mayor Cornett, if you could lead off with your testimony about examples you've seen as you administer the city of Richmond, and feel free to give us any information you have and can supply greater information at length for the record.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and distinguished members of the committee. It's a privilege and honor for me to be here today to represent the municipal government of Richmond, Indiana. My name is Roger Cornett, and I'm currently serving as mayor. I'm here to share with you information about situations that face our municipal government on a regular basis as a result of federal regulations. Our community of 38,000 people operates a public transit system which is composed of 6 fixed routes served by 9 buses. In addition, we operate a paratransit system for the exclusive use of the handicapped and senior citizens. This system has 5 fully equipped vans that provide on-call service 12 hours a day, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., 6 days a week. These vehicles are all equipped with wheelchair lifts and other amenities to satisfy the requirements of their constituents, senior citizens, and the handicapped. In 1993, it became necessary to replace some of the buses for the fixed routes. As a result of new federal regulations under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the new buses had to be equipped with wheelchair lifts, even though we were operating a fully equipped paratransit system. The additional cost per bus to provide this equipment was over $6,500 per unit. So far, we have received 5 buses for an additional cost of $32,500, with a 6th bus on order, and ultimately all 9 buses will be converted for a total cost of over $58,500. The overall cost of all 9 buses is $414,000, 80% of which is paid for by the federal government. Since the new buses started running in 1994, only 1 citizen has used the lifts on these buses. Even though this is not a tremendous amount of money, it's an example of an unnecessary expenditure in our community because of the one-size-fits-all mentality. In the future, we will have to modify the sidewalks wherever the bus stops to allow for a level spot with a concrete pad to land the lift. In order to satisfy this requirement, the city must install at least 132 concrete pads, 4 feet by 4 feet, at a total cost of $80,000. It makes no sense to spend the money necessary to comply with this additional requirement when only 1 citizen is unnecessarily using the equipment. In the case of these regulations and many others facing our city, we think there are alternative solutions that would cost much less. However, the one-size-fits-all mentality always prevails. Spending on regulations take priority over other expenditures in the community. Our city employees are usually the ones who suffer with inadequate compensation for their work and inadequate equipment to perform their duties safely. We are a working-class community and just not wealthy enough to satisfy federal requirements and still be fair to all our employees. There is no question that we could manage our fares more effectively with less cost if we had the freedom to act in a manner that's more appropriate for our city and its citizens. I am pleased that Congress is planning to institute a Corrections Day to address regulations that everyone would agree need to be changed. I hope you will consider regulatory problems facing us in Richmond on Corrections Day in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mayor Cornett. I appreciate you coming and testifying today. That was one of the issues that on the paratransit that came up at our field hearings and impressed me greatly, that it was an example where money was being needlessly spent. Mr. Hurd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for inviting me to discuss the needs for our correction of the most burdensome regulations. My name is James S. Herr, and I am Chairman and CEO of Herr Foods, Inc. in Nottingham, Pennsylvania, and I would ask that my written statement be submitted for the record. For an understanding of our problem, you need a brief history of my company. I started Herr Foods Company in 1946 with an investment of $1,750 and employed 1 woman half-time. I borrowed $1,700 from my girlfriend's employer, who was an attorney in Lancaster. My girlfriend and I got married a year later and worked together from 4 a.m. to 11 p.m. most every day to grow the business. We have 5 children and involved them in the business as much as possible while they were growing up. They are all married, and 4 of the 5 are actively involved in the business. The one daughter has her own business, small business of editing and proofreading in Peachtree City, Georgia. Today, our independent business, HERS independent business employs 1,000 plus people, and we think of each of them as our extended family. A lot of this growth came before the regulations got so burdensome. And I'd like to give you an example of that. We had a fire in 1951, which completely destroyed our buildings and our contents. And so we decided to start over, and we bought a 37-acre farm in Nottingham, Pennsylvania, demolished the barn and built a 40 by 90 factory, and bought some used equipment and started up operations in 6 months from the time of the fire. By contrast, in 1989, we decided to build a 15,000 square foot warehouse in Elk Ridge, Maryland. It took 2 years to get all the permits and cost us additional funds because of wasted time and regulations. If the 1989 regulations had been in place in 1951, we never would have been able to hold our customers and start up again. I might add, in 1952, we started our business in a depressed area in Nottingham, Pennsylvania, which is now enjoying an additional infusion of $14 million in wages per year. Total company wages are 29 plus million. When Congress passes laws, part of the burden is that the laws get caught in bureaucracy. The Clean Water Act, for example, has been taken over by regulatory bureaucracy and delay. One of the principal concerns of business today is the time and effort consumed in merely attempting to conform to the regulation. As regulatory agencies mature, the method of obtaining approval becomes increasingly difficult, with more and more individual approvals required for each succeeding application. Time frames for approval become distorted and extended as each person required to review and sign off on a given application seems to want to leave his or her mark on it. We have great need for the regulation writers to have a common sense understanding of the business people who are carrying out the regulations. Many regulations are too cumbersome and communications break down. It takes too long these days to get permits necessary to grow and expand a business. Take the environmental regulators as an example. I agree that we need to protect our environment, and I think most all businessmen will agree. What then is the common sense solution to improving the environment? If the regulators would state the problem they see and work together with the business person for a solution, we could solve the problem and do it in a much shorter time frame. This would be much more productive than trying to catch the business person in a moment of trouble and sock them with a fine. However, for the most egregious and burdensome regulations, I believe the concept of Correction Day seems to be a step in the right direction. The time has come to focus not on instituting new regulations. Instead, Congress should take this opportunity to correct the regulations that everyone can agree are outdated, are overly burdensome, and are too complex. From where I'm sitting, the mood is already shifting out there. Some government agencies seem to be understanding that many rules they make do not work. However, more must still be done. I hope this mood continues to grow, and I hope that Congress and the agencies can work together to eliminate archaic and oppressive regulations for the betterment of our society. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address your committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Herr, and your full statement will be made part of the record for this proceeding.
Thank you.
Let me ask Mayor Cornett if the city could have a process by which they could seek waivers for this requirement under the Americans with Disabilities Act and perhaps other mandates that the federal government places on local government. Would that be something that you would see as a useful correction that could be brought up Or would you recommend that we try to address these as we hear from each government about particular regulatory processes?
I think seeking a waiver would be certainly an alternative. There are many times at the local level that because of circumstances, special situations, that an appeal on a particular rule would be in order, in my opinion, in order for common sense to prevail. In my opinion, because of the one-size-fits-all mentality, or I can't make an exception because then I'll be in big trouble, common sense doesn't prevail. And if I don't find any problem with making an exception. I think if it's common sense, it's good to make an exception and still enforce the rule maybe equally or the same elsewhere. We just get very frustrated, and the frustration leads to anger, frankly, when common sense doesn't prevail because of what it might affect somewhere else. With all due respect to other communities, we'd like to be able to do what's right by our citizens without being influenced by what's going on elsewhere.
Well, actually, without opening up the question fully, let's take, for example, one that was discussed this morning on San Diego with the sewage treatment. As a mayor in the Midwestern city where those requirements are necessary sometimes in order to protect groundwater and other treatment is necessary because of the geographic situation there, which is very different than San Diego's being next to the ocean. Would it cause a problem for you or for the city if San Diego were given a waiver or there was a process by which they didn't have to comply with a particular regulation, but because it did make sense for cities in the Midwest and others to have that regulation apply to them? So that, I guess, putting yourself on the other side of that, where you were not able to receive a waiver, but some other city was, would you envision that as being a fair process?
I think I certainly would. I think as long as has been stated here this morning that the policy or the ultimate result is obtained, I would have no problem at all in granting other cities exceptions or allowing us to do things a bit differently than other people and therefore let them do things differently. As long as we end up with a clean environment, as long as we end up with a safe place for all of us to live, there has to be more than one way to solve things, depending on the soils. And our landfill, for instance, has a special soil which is different than other places. And we think that the rules that apply to that ought to be different because of the different makeup. And yet, so much of it is whatever we do here, we have to do everywhere, whether it makes sense or not.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think that is a correct approach. Mr. Hurd, let me ask you a question really about your business experience. Have you found that in the past, because of some of these regulations and perhaps the permitting requirements needed in order to expand your facilities, that you've made decisions which have resulted in perhaps slower growth than you would have liked to see, or even in some cases necessary to close down some operations and perhaps therefore cause the loss of job opportunities in some communities?
Well, the one that I indicated to you up here in Maryland, it of course hampered our business by 2 years as far as building the warehouse. So we may have had more product in the Washington area if we could have started 2 years earlier. However, we're right in the midst right now of working on a solution to our wastewater at our home plant. And we've been working for a whole year now and trying to solve that problem, and it seems like it goes from one person to another person to another person. And it's just very difficult to get it solved. I cannot say that we were shut down or hampered in any way by these people, but it just seems like it's very difficult to get decisions out of these organizations.
I appreciate that. Let me ask a question on a slightly different tack, and it was picking up on something the speaker had mentioned earlier today, which was members would no longer be in a position where a constituent, in this case the mayor or Mr. Hur's congressman or other members that you're aware of, are confronted with these type of problems, and the member says, well, there's not much I can do because that's held up as part of a reauthorization of a larger bill. and he thought that was a valuable way of empowering constituents to be able to call upon their members to do that. Have either of you experienced in the past in dealing with members of Congress the phenomena where there was a sympathy for the problem that was brought to them, by you to them, but this general inability to operate because of the procedures requiring a larger look, or that the particular problem which may be rifle shot being caught up in a larger process here in Congress? Is that something that you had heard from members who had represented your communities in the past?
Certainly I have. On the instance that I indicated here, there are others who agree that this is not necessary to put these lifts in, but they say, we don't have any choice, you have to go ahead and do it. And if you don't, the funds will stop. I haven't had any of them directly blame Congress, as has been mentioned here this morning, but obviously that's where the ultimate decision is made, and that's the easiest place to dump it.
I might add on that very issue that he was speaking about, we've spent about $100,000 extra putting in walkways and things for the handicapped people, and I doubt very much if we've had anyone use it, or might be one or two people using it. So it seems like there's a lot of waste there, and I think it cost businesses a lot more than what they anticipated when they started, because I was at the hearing with President Bush when we testified against that for that very reason, but it was made very clear to us that this is going to pass regardless of what we said, and it did, and it cost us money, but it cost all businesses money. Now, and I don't know how you evaluate that as far as helping the American people.
On that, yes. And if I understand correctly, Mayor Cornett, in your case, you also spend money on the paratransit system so that there's an alternative to provide the very same service.
That's right. It's customized door-to-door by appointment, yes.
Thank both of you. I have no further questions. Do any of the other members?
I have one tiny question, if I may. First of all, we appreciate the testimony of both of you gentlemen. I have a very minor question of the mayor, if he'd be so kind, just as a matter of curiosity. You testified both to the fact that you have to retrofit your 9 regular buses with lifts for handicapped, I guess for disabled specifically, but you also mentioned that in the future you've got to put down these 4x4, I think it's 4x4 concrete pads. And my question, just out of curiosity, is do you have to provide these same pads for the paratransit buses or vehicles at all, or are they able to operate without them?
No, but those go to residences and pick people up and can be operated off the street.
Would you not do the same thing with the regular buses, perhaps? I mean, not to the residences, but do you, I mean...
Well, the buses aren't a fixed route, and they stop the same place every time, and that's where the regulation comes, that there needs to be a pad there for the lift to land on.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bielenson. Do any other members have any questions for the panel? Mr. Fox?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I wanted to ask Mr. Herr first to say welcome here. You've been a great business leader for us in the Northeast, and we appreciate all that you've done achieving the great American dream through your company. And we agree with you that the mood is changing here in Washington. We're trying to hold the line on taxes, become pro-business and pro-jobs, and the same process pro-reform. A follow-up to the chairman's question just moments ago dealt with, I would like to expand that by asking what % of businesses in NFIB that you represent would you say that didn't expand because of overregulation or couldn't grow due to that same problem?
I do not have the exact answer for that, but we can get it for you.
Okay. That would be helpful, because as we move forward in trying to have Corrections Day be a reality and to make the kinds of fundamental changes in Congress and how our agencies impact, I only have to look to a local business in my district near where your plant was established, your world headquarters, is that we have someone with a $25,000 contract with the government, only to have to hire an attorney, an accountant, and an engineer to respond to 187 pages of documents. So we perhaps need Mr. Herr, for you and Mr. Cornett to develop, if we can, some kind of liaison with bureaucrats so we can make the government more user-friendly and not just work through Congress, but if you're the people that have to have the regulations to put upon you, at least make sure that we're doing so that ones that are common sense, as you've stated, ones that are less expensive and less onerous, so we don't have people that have good products they could sell to the government, good services the government needs, only to walk away, not have a company grow, not have employees be paying taxes and stabilizing the economy, just because the regulations are so severe. So I didn't know what your thought was on how to make the government more user-friendly and therefore more pro-business.
Well, the one thing that I alluded to was the fact that if they would come to us with a problem, and I think it's already been brought out here that in various parts of the country you have different situations as far as the environment, how much water the land will take, and some things like that. And the thing that I was speaking to was the fact that if they came to us and said that you have a problem here, and how are you going to solve it? And if we'd tell them, okay, the best way to solve that problem, we'd get our engineers, and there are a lot of engineers out there that we can get for nothing that would be glad to come in because they supply us with some various supplies. And we can get a lot of expertise that the offices do not have, but it is different than what the regulation says. If the regulations, I think the problem is they try to write the regulation to meet every circumstance, and I don't think you can do that. I think that we need to have a regulation that says, okay, we're going to clean up the environment, and we want you to tell us how would you do that, and then have a meeting, a joint meeting, and work on it together, and we could get to the bottom of the problem. But when you have to go from this person to this person to this person, I mean, we're waiting now about 2 months just to figure out if we can, they want a couple extra monitoring wells. Well, we're glad to put the monitoring wells in, but we can't get the okay to even do that. And the only basic problem that I said, when we have a monitoring well, that's fine. I'm all for that because that tells you what the water's like, the groundwater. And the only thing is that when your man comes out to check that monitoring well, I want my man to be right there and take a sample too. And we've found out that it was a good thing we did that because the agency came back and said that certain things were wrong. And we said, wait a minute. What are you talking about? And we got our samples out and our records and found out that they didn't even have a record on that particular well. They lost it somewhere along the line. So those are the things that go on that are very frustrating for the business people.
Well, that's why I think it would be good to have the reality check here so that the regulations have some semblance back to common sense,
Yeah.
and that we need to have the business sector through NFIB and other related groups have a contact with the bureaucracy that we have to fund and to make sure that what we're doing is not more burdensome but less burdensome. So if you can get back to us through NFIB and Mr. Cornett about other problems that aren't in the testimony that Chairman McIntosh, Chairman Dreyer, and Chairman Solomon should have, well, we'd certainly appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Fox. Are there any other questions for this panel of witnesses? Well, let me thank both of you for coming and testifying today. I appreciate particularly individuals who are willing to travel to bring their views forward to this committee, and it will be enormously helpful to have real examples of what some of the problems are as we move forward with this process. We will keep you informed as to how it goes forward, and hopefully all of America will see that Congress is moving to correct many of these problems. So thank you. Let me now turn the gavel over to my colleague, Mr. Dreyer, for the remaining panel. In so doing, let me commend him for his help in this effort, his expertise in the rules of the House and how we can make this new process work is invaluable. And I know his commitment to reform is long-standing. And so it's a pleasure to be able to serve with him. Let me turn over the gavel to Mr.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me say at the outset that I appreciate the very, very helpful testimony that's been provided to this point. And in his opening statement, the Speaker made it very clear that when it comes to actually implementing his concept of a corrections day, we will need to rely on staff, first-rate staff to provide us with the detailed analysis that will be necessary. And at this point, we are going to deal with some former staff members of the House of Representatives, some experts who have worked very closely with me when I had the privilege in 1993 of co-chairing the Joint Committee on the Organization of Congress. First, we're going to hear from Mr. Peter Robinson, who is a founder of Bailey and Robinson, a government affairs unit of Ketchum Public Relations. Prior to his current position, he was senior aide to Speakers Tom Foley and Jim Wright. He also served as assistant parliamentarian for the House of Representatives for a 12-year period. We'll also hear from Mr. David Mason, who is the director of the U.S. Congress Assessment Project for the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Mason previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for House Affairs. He served for almost 10 years on Capitol Hill as a staff member for Senator John Warner, Representative Tom Bliley, and then House Republican Whip Trent Lott. And Dr. James Thurber is Professor of Government and Director of the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies and the Campaign Management and Lobbying Institutes of the American University in Washington. Dr. Thurber has served in government as a legislative assistant to the late U.S. Senator Hubert H. Humphrey and U.S. Representative John G. O'Hara of Michigan. He was also a consultant to the very famous and powerful Joint Committee on the Organization of Congress in 1993 and 1994. It took a new majority to implement much of its work, I should note. And last but not least, our very good friend and now very important executive from Cap Cities ABC, Mr. Pitts. Mr. Pitts, as we all know, served as the Chief of Staff to former House Republican leader Bob Michel. He served for a quarter of a century as a floor assistant to our Republican leadership. I welcome all of you and look forward to some great recommendations as to how we can take this concept, which virtually everyone has acknowledged can, in one form or another, be helpful to deal with some of the concerns of the American people. And we'll start out with you, Mr. Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to appear before the distinguished members and chairman of the two subcommittees today to discuss a corrections process or calendar in the House of Representatives. As you've indicated, I believe the specific purpose of this panel is to explore the procedural options, ramifications about particular legislation to address particularly burdensome rules, regulations, and the like. I'll turn to the procedural aspect in a moment, but I really am wearing two hats, I think. One is based on my experience here in the House of Representatives, first in the parliamentarian's office, then as a strategic aide to the former Democratic leadership. But since I left Capitol Hill, I have been engaged in government relations practice with Bailey and Robinson, a unit of Ketchum Communications. I'd like to immediately note that my firm is completely bipartisan and that my partner, Mr. Bailey, is an inveterate Republican. So we are actively involved on both sides of the aisle. In our business, we represent a variety, often of highly regulated industries, including manufacturing, pharmaceutical, health, energy, financial services, and transportation, just to name a few. I have witnessed a variety of instances where federal regulations or their enforcement lacked flexibility, predictability, and common sense to the point of goofiness or worse. Working these problems out has involved intensive work with concerned members and committees of Congress as well as with the agencies. We have often found that a serious problem or a dispute, particularly where a specific industry has become a target, may require coordinated campaigns involving all types of communications. I can testify that real jobs and the survival of real businesses are often at issue. And there's no doubt that the efforts underway in this Congress are something that's much needed out there. When a business or state or local government has a dispute with an agency, specific and immediate corrective legislative action sometimes is the route, but often I have found that it's a route of the last recourse. Part of the way our system works frequently is for industry to try to negotiate with the agencies while working with Congress to try to bring out a negotiated solution. And one of the things I would like to point out is that with regulators and even with Congress, there is frequently simply a lack of simple information and understanding about an industry and how it works. I'll throw out one small example. When the administration proposed the BTU tax several years ago, which went down in flames in the Senate, but which passed this House, very few people in the administration or in Congress recognized the unique status of the aluminum industry, where electricity is, chemically speaking, an essential ingredient of making aluminum rather than an incidental use by the industry. And it took months to carry this argument through the administration and through Congress in order to get special treatment of this in the BTU tax as it passed the House. I would also point out that there's often science on both sides of an issue, and that information and educational campaigns are a very necessary part of working with the agencies and with Congress. After all, I think industry will tell you that most of the time it's essential to establish some kind of working relationship with the agencies. Sometimes that's, frankly, is out of fear, but also it can lead to a more productive relationship in the future. As to a piecemeal approach to regulatory correction, I would say it is unfair for industry to have to guess how they're going to have to comply with regulations. But it also is probably inappropriate for federal officials not to know where the law is going on a day-to-day basis. They have to have notice, and they have to know where they're going to be down the line. While some have characterized Corrections Day as a boon to lobbyists, I think that's a little exaggerated. There's also a flip side of this issue, which I think all of you have seen, which is the fact that industry makes marketplace decisions all the time based on the law as they understand it and the status of regulatory enforcement. Much of the focus here has been on the environmental, in the environmental arena. But one need only look at the financial services industry, the computer industry, to realize the effect on long-range planning that the present status of FTC review, antitrust review, and the law on the books has. A Microsoft, for example, is keenly aware of where the law is and where it's going at every step it takes. For every private sector loser, there's also likely to be a winner in complicated areas of law such as energy, telecommunications, and the like. So I believe that Congress must proceed carefully in upsetting this apple cart. Therefore, I recommend that if there is a corrections process, that there need to be strict guidelines and review to qualify proposals. There must be some type of committee review. The administration should be heard. Every attempt should be made to consult all affected parties, as a change in the law or regulations may have a ripple effect or unintended consequence not at all apparent in the text of the bill. A simple revision or correction may have an unknown effect on how other related laws should be administered or how courts will construe legislative history or the general obligations of the agencies. Finally, there should be some bipartisan input, such as through an informal clearing committee with members with some of the expertise and background to judge the qualifications of a proposal and to put it into the context of the whole body of law. There might also be some responsibility on this committee to actually assess the likelihood of Senate action. I would not recommend that these guidelines be written into the House rules. And as a matter of fact, I probably would not recommend that a formal corrections calendar process itself be written into the rules. The rules of the Republican Conference on suspension are quite explicit, and something along this line might suffice. What other options are there for dealing with agencies which seem to lack guidance or have too much authority or seem to be making inflexible and erroneous decisions? The appropriations process is one clear option and one of the best congressional avenues of oversight on a year-to-year basis to keep agencies on a short leash. Limitations on the use of the funds are available within certain guidelines under the House rules, not to change the law, but to deny the use of funds for certain purposes, rules, or regulations. And as a matter of fact, it's through the appropriations process, through limitations and even legislation, that you force the Senate to address something, since appropriation bills are must-pass legislation. Despite the hue and cry about legislating in appropriation bills, I've often found that the authorizers who are unable to process authorization bills rely on the appropriations process to make their own points. The State Commerce Justice Appropriation Bill is a perfect case in point where most of the programs are unauthorized, and year to year, the appropriations bill is what keeps the agencies on a leash and gives them direction. Another thing you might think about is simply reinstituting the authorization process. Far too often, important agencies and departments have no authorization year after year, and this is clearly a venue to have some direction to the agencies and to make policy. Another targeted approach to congressional review, of course, is the regulatory reform that's moving through Congress. Whether a moratorium or a congressional veto approach, while not specifically a correcting approach, it certainly could effectuate that result. As far as regular calendars of the House are concerned, I'm aware of only 2 calendars which are subject matter specific, and that's the private calendar and the D.C. calendar. Now, neither one of them are used very much. As a matter of fact, there might be correcting resolution which is suitable for the private calendar. It's probably not a very usable avenue, however, because only a couple of members objecting can kill a bill. Motions to suspend the rules clearly are available under the guidelines on the Republican conference rules. I would point out that while motions to suspend the rules can pass anything, the vast majority of bills under suspension have been reported from committee and have had review. Then there's the Rules Committee with the expertise to clear either individual or omnibus corrections measures. However, generally, a report by a committee with jurisdiction is presumed with the Rules Committee. Finally, just a general comment on how you proceed in terms of if you do decide to set up a process, how you do it, and whether it becomes a part of the House rules. My advice, based on experience, is that while there is a constant political backdrop to the House rules, they generally avoid and should avoid elevating legislation dealing with certain subjects or based on certain premises. I remember back in the 102nd Congress when I helped the Democratic leadership craft a rule that required every spending or revenue bill to contain as part of its text a CBO cost estimate. The purpose was political and quite clear, to ensure that congressional scorekeeping rather than OMB scorekeeping under administration of the different party would control budget decisions. This rule was difficult to implement, was ignored, and was repealed 2 years later. And I think that's an example of a symbolic approach in the standing rules that shouldn't be repeated. That concludes my testimony at this point.
Thank you very much, Mr. Robinson. You have in large part outlined early on in your testimony exactly what it is that we're trying to pursue here, and I appreciate that. We have a recorded vote on it. We've asked Mr. Fox to cast his vote and then come back, so we're going to recess, but I think it'll be very brief because Mr. Fox will then call on that very famous Claremont McKenna College graduate, Mr. Mason, to proceed with his testimony. So we'll stand in recess for just a few minutes.
Yes.
We'll continue our coverage of this hearing on congressional legislation in just a moment. First, this program